When we begin to trace the birth of John Galt, we must first turn back the pages of history to the moment when a woman named Ayn Rand stepped onto the literary stage, clutching a manuscript that would become a cornerstone of 20th century thought. It was the year 1957, the summer of a world still trembling from the aftershocks of two global wars, and Rand, born Alisa Zinovievna Rosenbaum in the waning days of the Russian Empire, had already lived through the cataclysm of the Bolshevik Revolution, the harshness of Soviet collectivism, and the disillusionment of exile. Her early years in Petrograd were marked by the stark contrast between the promise of a utopian society and the crushing reality of state-imposed scarcity. Those experiences, she would later recall, left an indelible imprint on her soul. "I was a child of the revolution, and I saw the death of the individual in the name of the collective." In the quiet of her New York apartment, she began to shape a character who would embody the very antithesis of that collectivist nightmare, a man whose name would become a rallying cry for those who believed that the mind, not the mass, should be the engine of progress. Rand's personal history is inseparable from the philosophical foundations of John Galt. After fleeing Soviet Russia in 1926, she arrived in the United States with little more than a suitcase and a fierce conviction that the world she had known was a falsehood. She worked as a screenwriter in Hollywood, a place where the promise of individual creativity seemed to flourish, yet where the studio system often demanded the surrender of personal vision to the demands of profit and mass appeal. It was here that she first encountered the intellectual currents of the New York scene, a milieu populated by the likes of Irving Fisher, Nathan Berg, and the budding circle of what would later be called objectivists. In the early 1930s, Rand began to articulate a philosophy that rejected both the collectivist doctrines of her homeland and the altruistic moralities that she perceived as the dominant currents in American liberal thought. She called this philosophy objectivism, a term that would later become a banner under which a small but fervent community gathered. The 1930s also witnessed a crucial split within that burgeoning community. On one side stood Rand and a handful of loyal followers who were drawn to her insistence on rational self-interest and the moral supremacy of the individual. On the other side were thinkers who, while sharing a disdain for Soviet totalitarianism, remained more sympathetic to progressive social reforms and the nascent welfare state. The split was not merely academic, it was personal, marked by heated debates in cafes, the exchange of long letters, and the eventual formation of separate study groups. One anecdote from that era tells of a meeting in a cramped Manhattan loft where Rand, her voice steady but urgent, declared that the only moral purpose of a man's life is the achievement of his own happiness. The room fell silent, and a young philosopher named Nathaniel Brandon, who would later become one of Rand's most prominent disciples, responded with a hesitant nod. This moment crystallized the divergence, Rand's uncompromising stance on egoism versus a more tempered, perhaps even compassionate, approach to social responsibility. The split set the stage for a movement that would later find a new home in the libertarian circles of the 1970s, where John Galt would be resurrected as an emblem of defiant individualism. It was within this context of personal exile, ideological schism, and a relentless quest for a philosophy that could reconcile reason with desire that Rand began to write Atlas Shrugged. The novel was not conceived in a single sitting. Rather, it emerged from a series of serialized publications, a strategy Rand employed to gauge public reaction and to finance the massive undertaking. In 1954, she released the first part, titled Non-Commercial, in the Objectivist newsletter. The subsequent installments, the theme and the counter-theme, followed in quick succession, each building a world where the brightest minds of industry, science, and art began to vanish, leaving a society that sputtered under the weight of its own demands. The serialization allowed Rand to refine her ideas, respond to criticism, and perhaps most importantly, to cultivate a readership that would become the backbone of the novel's eventual success. The heart of Atlas Shrugged beats most loudly in two unforgettable passages that have become touchstones for anyone who has ever questioned the role of the individual in society. The first is the radio speech delivered by John Galt, a figure whose very name, Galt, is a condensation of gallant, glorious, and great. In Chapter 7, after a series of mysterious disappearances, the world's most brilliant engineers, writers, and thinkers have been systematically withdrawn from the public sphere. Galt, a man of enigmatic background, steps onto a deserted stage in the middle of a bustling city square, and he commandeers the airwaves. His words cascade across the nation like a tidal wave of reason. "I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine." He continues, "I have been in love with the idea of the mind's freedom for a long time. and I have come to see that the only way to protect it is to withdraw it. He then outlines the moral justification for the strike of the mind. A withdrawal of the motor of the world, a phrase that has become synonymous with the novel's central metaphor. This speech, delivered in a calm, resonant tone, is not a mere monologue. It is a philosophical manifesto that invokes the natural rights tradition of John Locke, who wrote, "All men are naturally in a state of perfect freedom to order their actions as they see fit, within the bounds of the law of nature." Rand's Galt reinterprets Locke's natural rights through a lens of rational egoism, asserting that the right to pursue one's own happiness is not merely a legal construct, but a moral imperative rooted in the very nature of human beings. The second emblematic episode is the strike of the motor of the world, a phrase that captures the collective exodus of the productive elite. In the novel, the motor, embodied by a massive, state-run railway line that transports essential goods across the continent, begins to sputter and stall. The cause is not a technical failure, but the deliberate abandonment of its operators, the engineers, and the inventors who refuse to be coerced into serving a system that punishes excellence. As the novel describes, the world's most productive minds had disappeared, and the rails fell silent, as if the very pulse of progress had been cut. This metaphorical strike serves as a narrative device to illustrate the consequences of a society that demands sacrifice from its most capable members while denying them the fruits of their labor. It also echoes Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the overman who creates his own values in a world devoid of inherent meaning. Where Nietzsche's Übermensch is a solitary creator of meaning, Galt is a collective embodiment of that principle, a leader who inspires a community of creators to withdraw their talents until society learns to respect the sanctity of the individual mind. To understand why Rand positioned Galt as a modern heir to both Nietzsche and Locke, we must examine the philosophical threads she wove together. Nietzsche, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, famously proclaimed, "Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Superman." He urged humanity to transcend the herd mentality, to become creators of their own destiny. Rand took that call for transcendence and reframed it within a capitalist framework, arguing that the highest expression of human potential is realized not through the subjugation of the self to the collective, but through the unbridled exercise of rational self-interest. Locke, on the other hand, provided the natural rights language that gave Galt's strike a moral foundation, the right to life, liberty, and property. By marrying Nietzsche's existential affirmation of the individual with Locke's legalistic articulation of natural rights, Rand fashioned Galt as a synthesis, a philosopher king of the market, a man who embodies both the creative will to power and the immutable entitlement to pursue his own happiness. The influences that shaped Rand's thinking extend beyond these two philosophers. Aristotle's virtue ethics, with its emphasis on the development of character through rational activity, is a subtle yet persistent undercurrent in the novel. Aristotle taught that eudaimonia, human flourishing, is achieved by living in accordance with reason, and that virtues are habits cultivated through purposeful action. In Atlas Shrugged, the protagonists are not merely successful businessmen. They are individuals who have honed the virtue of rationality into a habit, a second nature that guides every decision. Dagny Taggart, the novel's heroine, exemplifies this when she reflects, "I have always believed that the purpose of a mind is to think, and that the purpose of a life is to act upon those thoughts." This sentiment mirrors Aristotle's assertion that the good life is a life of rational activity, performed with excellence. Equally significant is the imprint of Murray Rothbard, the American economist and political theorist, whose anarcho-capitalist ideas would later find a receptive audience among libertarians in the 1970s. Rothbard argued that all human interactions could be mediated through voluntary exchange, without the need for a coercive state. While Rand never embraced the full anarchist stance, she maintained a limited government to protect individual rights. Her depiction of a society that collapses under the weight of bureaucratic overreach resonates with Rothbard's critique of state power. In Atlas Shrugged, the government's attempts to save the economy through dirigist policies are portrayed as the very mechanisms that precipitate the strike. The novel's portrayal of a looter class, who demand the fruits of others' labor without contributing, aligns closely with Rothbard's description of the parasitic class that thrives on coercion rather than voluntary cooperation. The historical anecdotes that surround the novel's emergence further illuminate its impact. In the 1930s, as Rand's ideas began to circulate among New York intellectuals, the objectivist movement found itself at odds with the dominant left-leaning circles that dominated the city's literary salons. One evening, in the dimly lit back room of a Greenwich Village coffee house, a heated debate erupted between Rand and a young socialist named Harold Cohn. Rand, unflinching, declared, "The only way to stop the moral decay of the world is to stop sacrificing the mind on the altar of the collective." Cohn, taken aback, retorted that human beings are social creatures and no individual can thrive in isolation. The disagreement was emblematic of a broader cultural clash. The rise of a philosophy that celebrated the solitary genius against a prevailing belief in collective progress. The split was not merely theoretical. It led to schism that saw many early objectivists either drift toward more mainstream liberalism or double down on Rand's uncompromising vision, laying the groundwork for the later libertarian appropriation of her work. Fast forward to the 1970s, a decade marked by a resurgence of libertarian thought in response to the perceived excesses of the welfare state, the oil crisis, and the lingering shadows of the Cold War. In this climate, Atlas Shrugged experienced a renaissance. The novel's themes of government overreach and the sanctity of the individual mind resonated with a new generation of activists, economists, and political philosophers. A notable anecdote from that era tells of a small group of students at the University of Chicago who, after reading the novel, organized a midnight rally on campus. They held up a banner that read, "Who is John Galt?" and chanted the phrase repeatedly, turning it into a rallying cry for the burgeoning libertarian movement. This chant would later echo through the halls of the Cato Institute, the Mises Institute, and even the nascent Tea Party, cementing Galt's status as a symbol of resistance against coercive authority. The cross-references to other thinkers do not end with Nietzsche and Locke. Rand's engagement with the ideas of Friedrich Hayek, the Nobel-winning economist who warned of the knowledge problem inherent in central planning, is evident in the novel's depiction of a bureaucracy that attempts to dictate production without the insight of the innovators themselves. Hayek's assertion that the use of knowledge is the central problem of economics finds a narrative counterpart in the way the novel's protagonists, like Hank Rearden, confront a system that seeks to appropriate their inventions for the public good. Moreover, the novel's emphasis on the moral right to own the product of one's mind echoes the writings of John Stuart Mill, particularly his defense of individual liberty and on liberty. If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. Rand's Galt, in his radio address, essentially flips Mill's argument on its head. The individual's voice, when it stands for reason, must not be silenced by the majority. In the novel's setting, the influence of Aristotle's virtue ethics and Rothbard's anarcho-capitalism is not merely abstract. It manifests in concrete scenes that illustrate the practical application of these ideas. When Dagny Taggart discovers the hidden valley of Galt's Gulch, she encounters a community that lives according to the principle of rational self-interest. The residents, former industrialists and thinkers, have created a society where property rights are absolute, where voluntary exchange replaces coercive taxation, and where the pursuit of excellence is celebrated as a virtue. This enclave functions as a living laboratory for Rand's synthesis of Aristotelian virtue and Rothbardian liberty. The residents practice what Aristotle would call phronsis, practical wisdom, by aligning their actions with a rational understanding of their own flourishing. At the same time, they embody Rothbard's vision of a stateless market, where contracts are honored not because a government enforces them, but because the parties recognize that mutual respect for property is essential to their own well-being. One of the most vivid examples of this synthesis is the scene in which the engineer John Galt himself explains to a skeptical visitor why he chose to withdraw his talents. He says, "I am not a thief, I am a creator. The world has taken from me the right to keep the product of my mind, and so I have taken back the right to live for myself." Here, Galt's assertion mirrors Aristotle's claim that the good for man is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, while simultaneously echoing Rothbard's assertion that the only legitimate function of a legal system is to protect the rights of individuals to their own bodies and the fruits of their labor. Galt's speech therefore becomes a bridge between the ancient philosophical tradition of virtue and the modern political theory of libertarianism. The novel also contains a second, equally powerful example of the strike of the motor of the world. In a later chapter, the nation's power grid begins to falter, not because of a shortage of fuel, but because the engineers who designed and maintain it have all vanished. The narrative describes the grid's failure as a darkness that fell upon the cities, a silence that was louder than any war. This metaphorical darkness is not merely a plot device. It serves as a stark illustration of the consequences of a society that fails to recognize the moral right of its creators. The darkness is a tangible representation of the void left when the minds that drive progress are forced into the shadows. It is a visual echo of the earlier railway strike, reinforcing the central thesis that the world's motor, its capacity to innovate, to build, to improve, cannot operate when the individuals who constitute that motor are denied the freedom to act on their rational judgment. The historical anecdotes, the philosophical cross-references, and the concrete textual examples all converge to paint a portrait of John Galt not merely as a fictional hero, but as an embodiment of a philosophical lineage that stretches from ancient Greece to modern libertarian thought. When we hear the question, "Who is John Galt?" echoing through the halls of a university, through the pages of a novel, or across the airwaves of a radio broadcast, we are confronted with a question that is both literary and existential. It asks us to consider whether we, like the novel's protagonists, are willing to stand up for the principles of rational self-interest, to defend the natural rights that Locke described, and to strive for the excellence that Aristotle celebrated. It also challenges us to examine the extent to which we have internalized the warnings of Nietzsche, who cautioned that the herd can drown out the voice of the overman, and the warnings of Hayek, who reminded us that centralized planning is doomed to fail without the dispersed knowledge of individuals. In the broader sweep of intellectual history, the figure of John Galt can be seen as a node where several streams intersect. On one side, we have the Enlightenment tradition of natural rights, articulated by Locke, Hobbes, and later by Jefferson. On another, the Romantic rebellion against rationalism, embodied by Nietzsche's call for the creation of new values. Between them lies the classical virtue ethic of Aristotle, which insists that moral excellence is cultivated through habit and reason. And beyond these, the 20th century libertarian tradition, shaped by Rothbard, Hayek, and the Austrian school, which argues that voluntary exchange and property rights are the bedrock of a free society. Rand's synthesis of these currents is not a simple amalgamation. It is a deliberate construction of a new philosophical architecture, one that places the mind at the center of moral and economic life. John Galt in this architecture is the keystone, a man who embodies the moral right to think, to create, and to reap the rewards of one's own labor. The novel's serialization itself is worth reflecting upon as a strategic choice that mirrors the very themes it explores. By releasing Atlas Shrugged in installments, Rand engaged directly with a reading public that could experience the stories unfolding in real time, much as the protagonists experienced the gradual erosion of their world. Readers were invited to witness the incremental withdrawal of the motor, to feel the tension as each new installment revealed another piece of the puzzle. This method of publication also allowed Rand to gauge the reception of her ideas, to refine her arguments, and to build a community of readers who, in many ways, mirrored the strike of the mind. Individuals who chose to align themselves with a philosophy that celebrated the primacy of the intellect over the demands of the collective. The impact of this approach can be seen in the way the novel's early readers formed discussion groups, much like the study circles of the 1930s objectivist movement. In a small apartment in Brooklyn, a group of young engineers would gather each week to dissect the latest chapter, debating the merits of Galt's speech, the ethical implications of the strike, and the relevance of Locke's natural rights to their own lives. Their conversations often drifted into the realm of personal practice. If we truly believe in the right to keep the product of our mind, how do we respond when our employer demands unpaid overtime? One participant, a mechanical engineer named Victor, answered, "By refusing to be a cog in a machine that does not value my contribution." This anecdote illustrates how the novel's philosophical arguments moved beyond the page, influencing real-world decisions and fostering a culture of intellectual self-assertion. The 1970s libertarian resurgence further amplified this cultural shift. As the United States grappled with stagflation, energy crises, and a growing distrust of government institutions, the ideas presented in Atlas Shrugged found fertile ground. Libertarian think tanks such as the Cato Institute and the Mises Institute began to cite Galt's speech in policy papers, arguing that the government's attempts to regulate industry were tantamount to forcing the productive minds of the nation to shrink-wrap their ideas for the benefit of the many. In a 1974 pamphlet titled The Gaussian Principle, a young economist wrote, "When the state tries to appropriate the fruits of the mind, it does not merely tax. It steals the very essence of human progress." This sentiment echoes Rand's original claim that the motor of the world cannot run on the backs of those who are compelled to surrender their intellectual property. Even as the libertarian movement adopted Galt as a symbol, it also reinterpreted his legacy through the lens of contemporary concerns. In the 1980s, during the rise of neoliberal policies, Galt's image was invoked by free market advocates to champion deregulation and privatization. In the 1990s, as the internet began to democratize the production and distribution of ideas, tech entrepreneurs cited Galt's philosophy to justify the rise of startups that operated outside traditional regulatory frameworks. In a 1999 interview, a pioneering software developer said, "When I read Galt's speech, I heard a call to build a world where the code I write belongs to me, not to a bureaucratic agency that wants to control it." This modern appropriation demonstrates how the core ideas embedded in Rand's novel continue to evolve, resonating with each new generation's struggle to balance individual creativity against collective demands. It is also essential to recognize the criticisms that have been leveled against both the character of John Galt and the philosophical framework he represents. One prominent counterargument, often raised by left-leaning philosophers, is that Rand's glorification of self-interest neglects the social interdependence that defines human life. Critics argue that by framing altruism as a moral vice, Rand overlooks the ways in which cooperative endeavors, such as public health initiatives, environmental protections, and social safety nets, can enhance rather than diminish individual flourishing. In response, proponents of objectivism point to the novel's depiction of the looter class, which they claim illustrates how forced redistribution harms the very people it intends to help. They maintain that a society built on voluntary exchange, as exemplified in Galt's Gulch, can still provide mutual aid through charitable actions that arise from genuine, rational choice, rather than from coercive mandates. A second counterargument focuses on the feasibility of Rand's idealized vision of a society composed entirely of rational, self-interested individuals. Skeptics question whether human nature can be distilled into a purely rational calculus, pointing to psychological research that highlights the role of emotions, biases, and social conditioning in decision-making. They contend that the novel's portrayal of a community of flawless rational actors is an unrealistic utopia. In defense, supporters highlight Aristotle's notion of practical wisdom as a cultivated virtue that can be developed through education and habit, suggesting that while perfect rationality may be unattainable, the pursuit of rational self-interest remains a worthy and achievable moral goal. Moreover, they argue that the novel's purpose is not to present a literal blueprint for society, but to illuminate the moral consequences of suppressing the mind, a cautionary tale rather than a definitive program. These debates underscore the enduring relevance of John Galt as a philosophical touchstone. Whether one views him as a heroic champion of liberty, a flawed idealist, or a literary device designed to provoke thought, his presence forces us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of human flourishing. Are we, as a civilization, willing to honor the rights of those who create, innovate, and think? Or do we continue to demand that the motor of the world run on a collective bargain that sacrifices the few for the many? In the quiet moments after the novel's final pages, the reader is left with a lingering echo of Galt's own words. "I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine." That declaration, spoken with a calm certainty, invites each of us to examine the balance between our own aspirations and the expectations of the societies we inhabit. In closing, the historical roots and literary context of John Galt reveal a tapestry woven from personal exile, ideological schism, philosophical synthesis, and cultural resonance. From Rand's early break with Soviet collectivism to the novel's serialized debut, from the striking image of the motor of the world to the resonant radio speech that still reverberates in libertarian circles. From the Nietzschean call to transcend the herd to Locke's articulation of natural rights, from Aristotle's virtue ethics to Rothbard's anarcho-capitalist vision, the character stands at the intersection of multiple intellectual traditions. The anecdotes of the 1930s objectivist split and the 1970s libertarian revival illustrate how Galt's image has been continually reinterpreted, each era finding in him a mirror for its own struggles over freedom, responsibility, and the role of the mind in society. As we reflect on these layers, we are invited to ask ourselves, not just who is John Galt, but what does it mean to live as a mind that refuses to be shackled, to create a world where the motor of progress runs on the fuel of rational, voluntary effort. The answer perhaps lies not in a single declaration, but in the ongoing conversation that Rand's novel has sparked, a conversation that continues to shape the philosophical landscape, one thoughtful listener at a time. When we turn our attention to the character of John Galt, we are not merely examining a fictional hero, but a living embodiment of a philosophical system that has, for decades, sparked both fervent admiration and fierce controversy. The objectivist foundations that Galt represents, rational self-interest, the virtue of productivity, and the non-aggression principle, are not isolated ideas, but a tightly interwoven moral architecture that seeks to answer the age-old question of how a human being ought to live. In this segment, we will unpack those core tenets, explore two classic philosophical examples that illustrate them, confront the most common counter-arguments, revisit two vivid historical moments that brought these ideas into the public arena, and finally situate Galt's ethics within the broader landscape of contemporary moral philosophy, drawing connections to thinkers such as Robert Nozick and Michael Sandel. Let us begin with the first pillar, rational self-interest. In objectivist terminology, this is often called rational egoism, a term that can sound harsh to ears accustomed to the altruistic language of many moral traditions. Yet the phrase is deliberately chosen to convey a precise meaning, the moral rightness of pursuing one's own life and happiness as an end in itself, guided by reason rather than by whim, passion, or the dictates of others. As Ayn Rand herself wrote, every man is an end in himself, not a means to the ends of others. The implication is simple yet profound. Each individual possesses an inherent moral claim to his own life, and that claim is not a gift bestowed by society, but a fact rooted in the nature of human beings as rational agents. John Galt's famous declaration, "I am the man who stopped the motor of the world," is, on its surface, a dramatic flourish. Beneath it, however, lies the assertion that the engine of civilization is not the collective will of the masses, but the purposeful, rational action of individuals who choose to live for their own sake. When Galt refuses to be a cog in a system that demands sacrifice, he is not merely rebelling against an external authority. He is affirming the principle that one's own life is the ultimate standard of value. In objectivist terms, this is the moral law of man's life is his own. The argument proceeds as follows: if a being is capable of thought, then it must act on the basis of values that sustain its life. To value anything else, be it another person, a nation, an abstract ideal, above one's own life is to deny the very condition that makes moral agency possible. In other words, the moral hierarchy is anchored in the primacy of one's own existence, and any attempt to invert that hierarchy leads inevitably to self-destruction. The second pillar is the virtue of productivity, which objectivism treats not merely as an economic activity, but as a moral virtue. Productivity, in this sense, is the act of creating values, of transforming the material world through purposeful work. It is the concrete expression of one's rational self-interest. When Galt designs the motor that would have provided boundless, clean energy, he is not simply inventing a device, he is exercising the highest form of human achievement. The creation of something that extends his life, enriches his mind, and by extension, offers the possibility of enriching others who voluntarily choose to accept it. As Rand famously asserted, the purpose of morality is to teach you, not to suffer and die, but to enjoy yourself and live. Productivity is the means by which we achieve that enjoyment, because it aligns our actions with our values and thereby sustains the life we cherish. The third pillar, the non-aggression principle, is perhaps the most widely recognized component of objectivist ethics, though it is sometimes conflated with libertarianism. The principle states that the initiation of force against another rational being is morally impermissible. It does not forbid the use of force in self-defense, nor does it prohibit the use of legal mechanisms to protect one's rights. Rather, it delineates a clear boundary. We may pursue our own interests, but we may not do so by violating the rights of others. In Galt's narrative, the refusal to be coerced into producing for a society that demands sacrifice is a manifestation of this principle. He does not simply withdraw, he actively resists the initiation of force, thereby upholding the moral law that each person's life is sovereign. To see these ideas in action, let us consider two philosophical examples that illustrate how Galt's moral framework operates. The first example is the argument that man's life is his own. This claim can be articulated as a syllogism. 1. All rational beings have a moral right to exist. 2. Existence requires the pursuit of values that sustain life. 3. Therefore, each rational being has a moral right to pursue the values of his own choosing. The conclusion follows that any system, whether it be a collectivist ideology, a theocratic mandate, or a bureaucratic apparatus, that demands the sacrifice of the individual's values for a purported greater good, is morally illegitimate. In Galt's world, the government's seizure of the motor's patents and the subsequent imposition of rationing are not merely policy errors. They are violations of the moral right of each inventor to enjoy the fruits of his own mind. The second example is the moral defense of voluntary exchange. In a market transaction, each party offers something they value less in exchange for something they value more. This mutual benefit is the hallmark of a free exchange, and according to objectivist ethics, a moral act because it respects the rational self-interest of both participants. When Galt refuses to sell his motor to a government that would force it upon the populace, he is not acting out of spite. He is exercising his right to decide how his creation will be used. Conversely, if a buyer were to offer a fair price for the motor, and Galt accepted, that would be a voluntary exchange that aligns with the virtue of productivity and the non-aggression principle. The transaction would be moral because it is based on consent, on the recognition that each party is the owner of his own life and the product of his own labor. These examples, while clear in theory, have provoked vigorous counter-arguments. The first major critique comes from the camp of classical utilitarianism, which holds that the moral worth of an action is determined by its contribution to overall happiness or utility. From that perspective, Galt's refusal to share the motor could be condemned as an act of selfishness that deprives the greatest number of people of a life-saving technology. Utilitarians might argue that the moral imperative is to maximize collective welfare, even if that requires individuals to sacrifice some of their own interests. They would ask, if the motor could eliminate energy scarcity for billions, does Galt not have a moral duty to relinquish his exclusive claim? The utilitarian response often invokes the greatest happiness principle, suggesting that the moral calculus must prioritize the aggregate over the individual. In response, objectivist defenders of Galt would point out that utilitarianism, by treating individuals as interchangeable units of utility, collapses the distinction between means and ends. The moral error, they argue, is not in caring about the welfare of others, but in subordinating one's own life to a nebulous, impersonal calculation. As Rand wrote, the purpose of morality is to teach you, not to suffer and die, but to enjoy yourself and live. The utilitarian approach, they claim, threatens the very possibility of genuine happiness because it forces individuals to become tools for the happiness of others, thereby eroding the moral foundation of voluntary action. Moreover, the utilitarian calculus often rests on uncertain predictions about outcomes. We cannot be sure that the motor would indeed be used to maximize happiness, nor that the process of coercively redistributing it would not generate new harms. The second counter-argument emerges from communitarian philosophers, who contend that an unbridled focus on self-interest erodes the social bonds that hold communities together. Communitarians argue that humans are fundamentally relational beings, whose identities are shaped by shared values, traditions, and mutual responsibilities. From this viewpoint, Galt's radical individualism might be seen as a threat to the social fabric, encouraging isolation, atomization, and a neglect of duties to family, friends, and the larger community. They might ask, if each person pursues only their own rational self-interest, how do we ensure that essential collective goods, public health, environmental stewardship, social cohesion, are maintained? The communitarian critique suggests that a moral system must balance individual rights with communal responsibilities. Objectivist proponents counter that the balance is already achieved when individuals act according to rational self-interest within a framework of voluntary cooperation. The non-aggression principle does not forbid caring for others, it merely forbids forcing them to care for you. When Galt chooses to share his motor with those who voluntarily purchase it, he is fulfilling a social role that is both moral and beneficial, without sacrificing his own values. The real danger to social bonds, they argue, comes not from self-interest but from the imposition of collective demands that ignore individual rights. As Rand observed, the smallest minority on earth is the individual. Those who deny individual rights cannot claim to be defenders of minorities. In this sense, the communitarian fear of erosion is, in the objectivist view, a misidentification of the source of social decay. Having examined the philosophical arguments and their critiques, we now turn to two vivid historical anecdotes that brought these debates from the pages of philosophy into the arena of public discourse. The first anecdote takes us back to 1962, when the Objectivist Institute, founded by Ayn Rand and her close associates, organized a series of public debates with leading existentialists in New York City. The existentialists, represented by figures such as Jean-Paul Sartre's American disciple, Albert Camus, though Camus himself was not present, his ideas loomed large, championed the notion that human existence precedes essence, that meaning is created through subjective choice, and that the absurd condition of life demands a kind of moral flexibility. In one memorable exchange, the Institute's spokesperson, Leonard Peikoff, challenged Sartre's claim that existence is absurd because there is no ultimate purpose. Peikoff responded, if there is no purpose, then the very act of choosing a purpose becomes an act of self-destruction, because it denies the rational nature of man who seeks to sustain his life. The debate was broadcast on public radio, and the audience was split between those who felt exhilarated by the stark affirmation of individual purpose and those who were unsettled by the rejection of existentialist freedom as a moral compass. This public confrontation helped crystallize objectivism's claim to a rational, purpose-driven morality, and it placed John Galt, though still a fictional figure at the time, into the public imagination as the archetype of the rational, purposeful individual. The second anecdote jumps forward to the 1990s, when a wave of Galtian protests erupted across the United States in response to a series of regulatory measures aimed at curbing corporate excesses. The protests began in Detroit, where a coalition of engineers, entrepreneurs, and libertarian activists gathered outside the headquarters of a major automotive manufacturer that had just been ordered to reduce emissions through a government-mandated cap-and-trade system. The protesters carried placards that read, "Galt's motor should not be regulated, and freedom to produce, freedom to thrive." Their rallying cry was not a blanket opposition to environmental protection, but a specific objection to the coercive element of the regulation, namely, the initiation of force through fines and production limits. The movement spread to New York, San Francisco, and even to a small town in Texas, where a local bakery refused to accept a city ordinance that would force them to donate a portion of their profits to a community food bank. In each case, the Galtian activists invoked the non-aggression principle, arguing that voluntary charity is moral, but compelled redistribution is not. The protests attracted media attention, prompting op-eds from both libertarian scholars and mainstream economists. While some commentators dismissed the movement as a thinly veiled defense of corporate greed, others recognized it as a genuine philosophical challenge to the expanding scope of state intervention. The Galtian protests thus serve as a concrete illustration of how objectivist ethics can translate into real-world political activism, and how the tension between individual rights and collective regulation continues to animate public debate. To deepen our understanding of where Galt's moral philosophy sits within contemporary discourse, we must turn to the work of Robert Nozick, whose entitlement theory of justice offers a libertarian counterpart to objectivist ethics. In his seminal book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Nozick proposes three principles: 1. Justice in acquisition, 2. Justice in transfer, and 3. Rectification of injustice. These principles together argue that a distribution of holdings is just if it arises from legitimate acquisition and voluntary exchange, and that any deviation from this pattern, such as redistribution, requires compensation. Nozick's theory resonates with Galt's emphasis on productive achievement and voluntary exchange, yet Nozick is more cautious about the role of the state, allowing a minimal, night watchman state to enforce contracts and protect rights. In contrast, objectivism, as exemplified by Galt, envisions a society where the state's only legitimate function is to protect individuals from force and fraud without any paternalistic interference. While Nozick's framework tolerates a minimal state, Galt's world imagines a scenario in which the state has been reduced to a purely protective agency, or in the extreme, absent altogether. The subtle divergence highlights a broader philosophical question: can a society sustain rational self-interest and the virtue of productivity without any governmental scaffolding, or is a minimal, rights-protecting state indispensable? The dialogue between Nozick and Rand's objectivism continues to shape contemporary libertarian thought, and Galt remains a touchstone for those who argue that the moral case for limited government rests on the primacy of individual rights. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we find Michael Sandel, a contemporary political philosopher whose critique of market morality challenges the very premise that voluntary exchange is inherently moral. In his book What Money Can't Buy, Sandel argues that the expansion of market mechanisms into spheres traditionally governed by non-market values, such as education, health, and civic duties, corrupts the moral fabric of society. He asks, when does the market crowd out the non-market virtues that give life its meaning? Sandel's concern is that by reducing all human interaction to price and profit, we risk eroding the sense of communal responsibility and shared purpose. From Sandel's perspective, Galt's refusal to share his motor unless compensated could be seen as an illustration of the market's encroachment on the common good. Sandel might contend that certain goods, like clean energy, should be treated as public resources, not commodities, because their value transcends individual preferences. The objectivist response to Sandel's critique pivots on the distinction between voluntary exchange and coercive redistribution. Galt's stance is not that everything must be bought and sold, but that any transfer of value must be consensual. If a community collectively decides, through a process of rational deliberation, to purchase the motor and allocate the cost among its members, that is a voluntary transaction, not a violation of the non-aggression principle. Moreover, the objectivist argument holds that the very act of creating the motor is an expression of the creator's rational self-interest. To force its use without compensation is to treat the creator as a mere means to an end, which Rand famously denounced. The law of identity, implies that a man is not the property of another. Sandals appeal to communal virtue, while noble may inadvertently legitimize the initiation of force because it presupposes that the community has a moral claim over the individual's product. The tension between these positions illustrates a central fault line in modern moral philosophy, the balance between respecting individual rights and fostering collective well-being. To further enrich our analysis, let us revisit a third philosophical perspective, the Rawlsian theory of justice as fairness. John Rawls, in A Theory of Justice, introduces the original position and the veil of ignorance as a method for deriving principles of justice that are fair to all. Rawls concludes that rational individuals would choose two principles: 1. Equal basic liberties for all, and 2. Social and economic inequalities arranged so that they benefit the least advantaged, the difference principle. From a Rawlsian lens, Galt's refusal to share his motor might be criticized as violating the difference principle, because the motor's benefits would not be automatically extended to the least advantaged unless the market price is within their reach. However, Rawls also emphasizes that liberties, such as the right to own the product of one's labor, are inviolable. Thus, there is an internal tension within Rawls's own framework that mirrors the tension we observe between objectivist self-interest and communitarian concerns. The dialogue between Rand's objectivism and Rawls's liberal egalitarianism continues to be a fertile ground for academic debate, and Galt's moral stance serves as a vivid case study for testing the limits of Rawlsian fairness. Returning to the first philosophical example, the claim that man's life is his own, we can deepen the analysis by drawing on the ancient Stoic tradition. The Stoics, particularly Epictetus, taught that the only thing truly under our control is our own judgments and actions, while external events are indifferent. This resonates with the objectivist assertion that one's life, defined by rational action, is the sphere of moral authority. Yet the Stoics also advocated for cosmopolitanism, the idea that we are all citizens of a universal community and that we have duties toward fellow humans. This subtle difference underscores a key divergence. Stoicism accepts that external conditions may be beyond our control, but it does not grant us the right to claim ownership over the products of our labor in the same way objectivism does. Galt's moral framework, by contrast, insists that the products of one's rational effort are extensions of one's life and therefore cannot be appropriated without consent. The Stoic perspective offers a philosophical foil that helps us see the unique emphasis objectivism places on property rights as an extension of personal sovereignty. Similarly, the second philosophical example, the moral defense of voluntary exchange, finds a counterpart in the medieval scholastic tradition, particularly in the work of Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas argued that just price is determined by the common estimation of value, and that trade, when conducted fairly, contributes to the common good. While Aquinas accepted the moral legitimacy of exchange, he also emphasized the importance of charity and the moral duty to aid the poor. In contrast, Galt's position would hold that charity is a voluntary act, not a compulsory duty. The comparison reveals that the moral justification for exchange can be grounded either in natural law, as Aquinas suggested, or in rational self-interest, as Rand and Galt propose. Both traditions recognize the value of trade, but they diverge on whether the market is a moral end in itself or merely a means to facilitate a broader moral vision that includes altruistic obligations. Let us now consider how these ideas play out in contemporary policy debates. Imagine a scenario in which a breakthrough technology, say, a new form of carbon capture, has the potential to dramatically reduce global emissions. According to Galt's ethics, the inventor who creates this technology has a moral right to determine how it is used, to set a price, and to engage in voluntary contracts with buyers. If a government attempts to nationalize the technology without compensation, it would be violating the non-aggression principle. Proponents of the utilitarian critique would argue that the collective benefit of immediate, unrestricted access outweighs the inventor's claim to exclusive profit. Communitarians might suggest that the technology should be shared as a public good, fostering social solidarity and environmental stewardship. Nozick's entitlement theory would side with the inventor, provided the acquisition and transfer were just. Sandel would ask whether the market price reflects the moral value of a cleaner planet, or whether we are allowing market logic to dominate a fundamentally ethical issue. Rawls might propose a system where the technology is licensed in a way that ensures the least advantaged can benefit. Each of these perspectives offers a distinct route to resolving the tension between individual rights and collective welfare, and Galt's stance provides a clear, if uncompromising, benchmark. The inventor's rational self-interest is the starting point, and any deviation must be justified by voluntary, mutually beneficial agreements. In the realm of everyday life, the moral defense of voluntary exchange can be illustrated through two concrete examples. The first is the modern gig economy, where platforms such as ride-sharing services allow individuals to offer their labor directly to consumers. A driver who chooses to work a certain number of hours, set his own rates within the platform's guidelines, and accept or reject rides is exercising rational self-interest and productive virtue. The transaction is voluntary for both driver and passenger, and the non-aggression principle is upheld as long as the platform does not coerce drivers into unwanted terms. Critics who label gig work as exploitative often invoke the altruism critique, claiming that the platform should be responsible for ensuring fair wages and benefits, even if that means imposing higher fees on drivers. From Galt's perspective, the moral question is whether the platform is initiating force by unilaterally dictating terms, or whether it is facilitating a voluntary exchange that respects each participant's right to pursue their own life. The second example concerns intellectual property in the digital age. When a software developer releases a piece of code under an open-source license, he voluntarily relinquishes exclusive control over his creation, allowing others to use, modify, and distribute it. This act can be seen as a form of voluntary exchange of rights. The developer receives reputation, community contributions, or perhaps financial support through donations, while the broader community gains a valuable tool. The non-aggression principle is preserved because no one is forced to use the software, nor is anyone compelled to contribute. However, if a corporation were to copy the code, incorporate it into a proprietary product, and sell it without attribution or compensation, that would constitute an initiation of force against the developer's property rights. The moral defense of voluntary exchange thus hinges on the respect for the creator's rational self-interest, even when the creator chooses to share his work freely. To bring these abstract discussions back to the narrative of John Galt, let us recall the moment in Atlas Shrugged when Galdwin, a fellow inventor, confronts Galt about the moral implications of refusing to give the motor to the world. Galdwin asks John, "What if your refusal condemns millions to die?" Galt replies, "If I give the motor away without compensation, I destroy the very principle that makes any moral action possible. The right of each man to own the product of his mind." This dialogue encapsulates the objectivist conviction that the means by which a good is achieved, through rational, voluntary effort, cannot be separated from its moral worth. The moral worth of the motor lies not only in its capacity to provide energy, but also in the fact that it was created through the purposeful, rational action of a free individual. The historical anecdote of the 1962 debates illustrates how this conviction was tested against existentialist claims of absurdity and moral relativism. The existentialists argued that meaning is invented, and therefore any claim to an objective moral law, such as the non-aggression principle, was, in their view, an imposition of an artificial order onto an indifferent universe. The objectivist response, rooted in the belief that reality is knowable, and that reason is the means by which we navigate it, positioned Galt's moral stance as a bulwark against the nihilism that existentialism risked. The debate did not resolve the philosophical dispute, but it highlighted the deep divide between a morality grounded in objective reality and one grounded in subjective choice. Similarly, the 1990s Galt-Ian protests demonstrated how the abstract principle of non-aggression could become a rallying cry for concrete political action. When the protests targeted a regulation that required corporations to allocate a fixed percentage of profits to a community fund, the activists framed their opposition not as a defense of corporate greed, but as a defense of the moral right to decide how to use one's own productive earnings. The protesters quoted Rand's line, "The question isn't who is going to let me, it's who is going to stop me," to emphasize that the moral battle was about the initiation of force, not about the desirability of philanthropy. The public debate that followed forced policymakers to confront the philosophical underpinnings of regulation. Is it legitimate for the state to compel individuals to act in ways that serve a collective goal, or does such compulsion violate the very rights that make a free society possible? In contemporary academic circles, the dialogue between objectivist ethics and other moral theories continues to evolve. Robert Nozick's entitlement theory, while sharing Galt's reverence for acquisition and exchange, diverges on the role of a minimal state. Nozick argues that a night watchman state is necessary to enforce contracts and protect property rights, whereas Galt's vision, especially in the later chapters of Atlas Shrugged, imagines a world where the state's power has been so eroded that individuals can operate without any external enforcement beyond private arbitration. This distinction raises a crucial question. Can a society sustain the moral fabric of rational self-interest without any institutional framework at all, or does the presence of a minimal, rights-protecting state serve as a necessary condition for the flourishing of productive virtue? The debate remains open, and scholars continue to cite Galt as a thought experiment that pushes the boundaries of libertarian theory. On the opposite side, Michael Sandel's critique of market morality invites us to reconsider the ethical limits of voluntary exchange. Sandel would ask whether a society that allows the commodification of all aspects of life, education, health, even political influence, ultimately undermines the shared values that bind us together. Galt's unwavering belief in the sanctity of voluntary exchange may appear, to Sandel, as an overly narrow view of morality that neglects the communal dimension of human flourishing. Yet, supporters of Galt might counter that the erosion of communal bonds is not caused by markets themselves, but by the coercive appropriation of market outcomes by the state or by other institutions that force participation. In this view, the market is a neutral arena where individuals can choose to cooperate, compete, or contribute to communal projects, provided those choices are made without force. The tension between these perspectives illustrates a central fault line in modern moral philosophy, whether the market is a moral neutral tool or a moral force that shapes values. To bring these abstract discussions into a more personal realm, consider the everyday decision of whether to donate to charity. From a utilitarian standpoint, the moral imperative is clear. If you have the means, you ought to give as much as possible to maximize overall happiness. From a communitarian perspective, giving is a social duty that reinforces communal bonds. From a Nozickian entitlement view, you are free to give, but you are under no obligation. From Sandel's market critique, you might question whether monetary donations reduce the moral quality of the act, turning generosity into a market transaction. From Galt's objectivist perspective, the decision to donate is a voluntary act of self-interest. You may choose to give because you value the act of generosity as part of your own happiness, but you are never morally obligated to sacrifice your own rational interests for the sake of others. The moral virtue lies not in the act of giving per se, but in the rational choice to do so, in alignment with one's own values. Finally, let us reflect on the broader implications of Galt's moral philosophy for the future of ethical discourse. The core tenets, rational self-interest, productive virtue, and non-aggression, offer a coherent framework that insists on the primacy of the individual as the locus of moral value. They challenge us to examine the hidden assumptions behind policies that treat individuals as means to collective ends, and they compel us to ask whether the moral language we use, terms like the common good, social responsibility, or public interest, might sometimes mask an initiation of force against the very people who are supposed to benefit. At the same time, the counter-arguments from utilitarianism, communitarianism, and market critics remind us that any moral system must grapple with the reality of interdependence, the fragility of social bonds, and the need for institutions that can mediate disputes without coercion. In navigating these complex waters, the figure of John Galt serves as both a beacon and a provocation. He invites us to imagine a world where individuals are free to pursue their own rational values, to create, to trade, and to live without the looming threat of force. He also forces us to confront the uncomfortable question: if we were to fully embrace this vision, what would our societies look like, and what would we be willing to sacrifice in the name of collective welfare? The answers are not simple, and the debate will undoubtedly continue for generations. Yet by engaging deeply with the objectivist foundations that Galt embodies, by scrutinizing the arguments and counter-arguments, by recalling the historic moments when these ideas stepped onto the public stage, and by situating them alongside the broader currents of contemporary moral philosophy, we gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of one of the most provocative ethical visions of the 20th century, and perhaps of the 21st as well. When we turn our attention to the third pillar of John Galt's intellectual edifice, reason, individualism, and capitalism, we are invited into a terrain where epistemology meets economics, where the very act of thinking becomes the engine of survival. Galt does not merely argue that reason is a useful instrument. He declares it the sole means by which man can navigate the hostile world and, ultimately, secure his own life. In the quiet moments of reflection, one might ask, what does it mean to claim that reason is not simply a faculty, but the very foundation of human existence? To answer, we must first trace the lineage of this claim, examine the concrete illustrations Rand offers in Atlas Shrugged, and then test the assertion against the fiercest criticisms of Marxist alienation and postmodern cultural contingency. The epistemological premise that reason is man's only means of survival has its antecedents in the Enlightenment, where thinkers such as John Locke and Immanuel Kant elevated the capacity for rational thought above superstition and tradition. Locke's assertion that the mind is a blank slate implied that knowledge, and therefore survival, is built through the active application of reason to experience. Kant later sharpened this by arguing that the categories of the understanding are the conditions for any possible experience. Rand, absorbing this lineage, reframes the argument in a distinctly objectivist hue. Reason is not a feeling, it is a faculty. In the novel, John Galt himself articulates the point with a quiet certainty that reverberates through the pages. I have never known any man who has ever succeeded in a great undertaking without the use of his mind. The statement is not a poetic flourish, it is a claim about the mechanics of existence. To see the claim in action, let us consider two vivid episodes from Atlas Shrugged that function as narrative laboratories. The first is the invention of the motor that powers Dagny Taggart's revolutionary railroad. In the novel, the motor is not merely a piece of machinery, it is the embodiment of human ingenuity, a concrete product of reason applied to the problem of harnessing energy. The motor's creator, a brilliant engineer, isolates the problem, formulates hypotheses, tests them, and finally produces a device that can transform raw power into motion. The process mirrors the scientific method. Observation, hypothesis, experiment, and conclusion. It is through this chain of rational steps that the motor comes into being, and it is precisely because the engineer trusts his mind that he can survive the competitive market, secure funding, and ultimately bring the invention to the world. The motor in Rand's narrative is a metaphorical lighthouse, its beam cutting through the fog of collectivist doctrine, guiding the ship of industry toward a safe harbor. The second illustration is the development of the copper mines in the West, a subplot that runs parallel to the motor's story. In the novel, the copper mines are operated by a cadre of independent entrepreneurs who, unshackled by government interference, apply rational planning to extract the metal efficiently. They assess geological data, calculate the most effective extraction methods, and allocate capital where the return on investment is highest. Their success is not the result of a collective decree or a mandated quota. It is the product of each individual's rational assessment of risk and reward. When the government imposes the equalization of burdens law, the mines grind to a halt, not because the workers lack will, but because the rational calculus that underpins their operation is distorted. The mines thus become a living case study. Reason guides the allocation of resources, and capitalism provides the mechanism by which those rational decisions translate into tangible wealth. In this way, the copper mines illustrate how reason, when paired with a free market, becomes a self-sustaining engine of survival. Yet, the claim that reason alone fuels survival does not go unchallenged. From the left, the Marxist tradition offers a starkly different diagnosis of capitalism's impact on the human spirit. Karl Marx famously wrote that the worker becomes all the more alienated the more he works. In the Marxist view, capitalism reduces the laborer to a mere cog in the industrial machine, stripping away the intrinsic satisfaction derived from creative, purposeful work. The alienation is not simply economic, it is existential. If we follow this line of thought, the rational decisions of entrepreneurs and engineers in the novel would be seen as complicit in a system that alienates the very workers who bring the motor and the copper mines to life. The question then becomes, does the rational pursuit of profit inevitably lead to alienation, or can reason, properly applied, preserve the integrity of the individual's labor? A second line of critique emerges from postmodern theorists who argue that reason itself is not a universal, timeless faculty, but a cultural construct contingent upon particular historical moments. Mitchell Foucault, for instance, contended that the regimes of truth are the result of power relations, suggesting that what we call reason is shaped by the dominant discourse of a given epoch. If reason is culturally contingent, then the objectivist claim that it is the singular path to survival appears to be an ethnocentric projection. The postmodern skeptic would ask, whose reason are we privileging? Whose standards of rationality are we using to judge the success of the motor or the copper mines? Are these standards not embedded within a Western, capitalist framework that marginalizes alternative modes of knowing? These counter-arguments invite us to interrogate the foundations of Galt's worldview more deeply. To address the Marxist critique, we can return to the notion of alienation as a product of forced collectivism rather than voluntary exchange. In Atlas Shrugged, the characters who choose to withdraw from the looted economy, those who go on strike under Galt's leadership, experience a profound reclamation of self. Their withdrawal is not an act of resignation but an affirmation of rational agency. When they return to productive work, it is on terms they have voluntarily set, free from coercive redistribution. In this sense, the novel suggests that alienation is not an inevitable byproduct of capitalism, but a symptom of state-imposed constraints that suppress rational choice. The motor's inventor, for example, finds renewed purpose only after he is liberated from the shackles of the equalization law. His rational mind, once again unencumbered, can channel creativity into invention, thereby alleviating alienation rather than reinforcing it. Addressing the postmodern charge requires a nuanced understanding of what we mean by reason. While it is true that the content of rational discourse can be historically situated, the faculty of logical inference, deduction, induction, and the testing of hypotheses remains a constant across cultures. The Austrian school, particularly Ludwig von Mises, emphasized that human action is purposeful and that individuals employ reasoning to achieve ends. Mises wrote, "Human action is always purposeful and always involves a choice. This purposeful action, grounded in rational calculation, does not dissolve under the weight of cultural contingency. Rather, it adapts to new contexts while preserving its logical structure." In the novel, the motor and the copper mines illustrate this adaptability. The same rational principles guide engineers in the 1920s and could guide innovators in the digital age. Reason, then, is not a static set of beliefs, but a dynamic tool that individuals employ to navigate whatever environment they encounter. To further illuminate these points, let us consider two historical anecdotes that bring the abstract debate into the realm of lived experience. The first takes us back to the 1940s, when Ayn Rand, fresh from the publication of the Fountainhead, engaged in a heated debate with her former lover and intellectual collaborator, Nathaniel Branden. Their dispute centered on the nature of love and rationality, a conversation that unfolded in the salons of New York and later in the pages of the Objectivist newsletter. Branden argued that love could be an irrational, emotional surrender, while Rand insisted that love, to be genuine, must be rooted in rational appreciation of another's virtues. She famously wrote, "The man who does not value himself cannot value anything else." In that debate, Rand asserted that love, like any other human activity, must be guided by reason if it is to be sustainable. The clash was not merely personal, it was a microcosm of the broader philosophical struggle to reconcile emotion with rational self-interest. The outcome, an eventual split between the two, underscored Rand's conviction that rationality cannot be compromised, even in matters of the heart. The anecdote serves as a concrete illustration of how the objectivist commitment to reason permeates all aspects of life, reinforcing the claim that reason is the sole means of survival, even in the most intimate spheres. The second anecdote brings us forward to 2005, when a gathering of economists, scholars, and entrepreneurs convened in Austin, Texas, under the banner of the Galt-Ian Conference. Organized by a think tank inspired by Rand's philosophy, the conference featured presentations on the empirical outcomes of deregulation across various industries, telecommunications, energy, and transportation. One speaker, a professor of economics, displayed a series of graphs showing that after the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the number of new entrants into the market rose by 27%, while consumer prices fell by an average of 12% over the next 5 years. Another presenter, an entrepreneur in renewable energy, cited data from a deregulated electricity market in Texas, where competition led to a 15% increase in renewable capacity within 3 years. The audience, composed of both staunch libertarians and skeptical scholars, engaged in vigorous discussion, but the prevailing sentiment was that the data corroborated Galt's assertion. When individuals are free to apply their rational judgment in a market context, innovation flourishes and society benefits. The conference, while not a formal academic summit, functioned as a living laboratory where the abstract principles of reason, individualism, and capitalism were tested against real-world outcomes. These anecdotes, when placed alongside the novel's fictional examples, create a tapestry that weaves together narrative, history, and empirical evidence. They also provide a platform to cross-reference other seminal thinkers who have shaped our understanding of the invisible mechanisms that guide human cooperation. Adam Smith, writing in The Wealth of Nations, introduced the concept of the invisible hand, suggesting that individuals pursuing their own self-interest inadvertently promote the public good. Smith's insight aligns with Galt's claim that rational self-interest, when unhindered, leads to collective prosperity. Yet Smith also warned of the propensity to truck, to barter, and to exchange, implying that the market is a natural extension of human reasoned interaction. Milton Friedman, the 20th century champion of monetarism, extended this line of thought by arguing that the great virtue of a free market is that it does not require a central authority to allocate resources. Friedman's emphasis on the power of price signals as information carriers echoes Rand's belief that reason, exercised by individuals, can solve complex coordination problems without coercion. Both thinkers, though separated by centuries, converge on the idea that rational choice, expressed through market mechanisms, is a reliable engine of societal progress. The Austrian school, represented by Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, offers a more granular analysis of why reason and markets are intertwined. Hayek's concept of spontaneous order posits that the market's complex coordination arises not from a grand design but from countless individuals using their knowledge, local, tacit, and often subconscious, to make decisions. Hayek famously wrote, "The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they know about what they really want." This humility about the limits of central planning reinforces Galt's argument that only the individual, employing his own reason, can accurately assess his needs and act accordingly. Mises, in Human Action, argued that all human action is purposeful, and that purpose is derived from the individual's valuation of ends. Mises's focus on purposeful behavior dovetails with Rand's assertion that reason is the faculty that enables individuals to identify and pursue values, thereby ensuring survival. When we juxtapose these classical liberal insights with the Marxist critique, a tension emerges. Marx's historical materialism suggests that the economic base determines the superstructure and that the capitalist mode of production inherently produces class antagonisms. Yet both Smith and Hayek would argue that the market's invisible hand mitigates such antagonisms by allowing voluntary exchange to align disparate interests. The Marxists claim that capitalism alienates labor can be reframed. If alienation is a product of coercive redistribution, then a truly free market, where individuals are free to apply reason, may actually reduce alienation by restoring agency. The novel's protagonists embody this reversal. Their withdrawal from a collectivist regime restores their capacity to think, act, and create on their own terms. The postmodern challenge, that reason is culturally contingent, invites us to examine how the very language of rationality is shaped by power structures. Yet even postmodern scholars acknowledge that the tools of logic, consistency, non-contradiction, empirical verification retain a degree of universality. Foucault's analysis of regimes of truth does not deny the existence of logical structures. It merely highlights that who gets to define what counts as truth can be a matter of power. In the context of Galt's philosophy, the power resides not in a state apparatus imposing a singular narrative, but in the individual's capacity to assess claims, test them, and accept or reject them based on evidence. The motor and the copper mines become case studies of this process. Each invention passes through a series of rational tests, and each market transaction is a test of mutually beneficial exchange. The universality of the logical process, then, transcends cultural particularities, even as the content of the inventions may differ across societies. To deepen our understanding, let us consider an analogy that captures the relationship between reason, individualism, and capitalism. Imagine a vast forest, dense with trees, streams, and hidden pathways. Reason is the compass that each traveler carries, a device that points toward true north, regardless of the terrain. Individualism is the traveler's will to embark on the journey, to choose a path, to carry supplies, to decide when to rest. Capitalism is the network of trails that have been forged over generations, each trail representing a market transaction, a contract, a shared understanding. When travelers use their compasses correctly, they can navigate the forest efficiently, discovering new clearings, resources, and vistas. If the compass is broken, the traveler may wander aimlessly, stumble into danger, or become lost. If the traveler refuses to move, the forest remains unexplored. If the trails are blocked by a wall erected by a central authority, the traveler cannot reach the resources beyond. The story of the motor and the copper mines is precisely such a journey. The engineers and miners, guided by their rational compasses, blaze trails through the wilderness of scarcity, turning raw material into power and wealth. The invisible hand, as described by Smith, is the wind that subtly guides the direction of the trails, ensuring that each traveler's path contributes to the overall health of the forest. Another analogy drawn from the world of music can further illuminate the point. Consider an orchestra performing a symphony. Each musician possesses a unique instrument, a set of skills, and an understanding of the score. Reason is the sheet music, an objective representation of the relationships between notes, rhythms, and dynamics. Individualism is each musician's interpretation of their part, the personal nuance they bring to the performance. Capitalism is the concert hall, the ticket market, the audience's willingness to pay for the experience. When each musician reads the sheet music correctly, applies their talent, and the concert hall is open to the public, the symphony resonates, creating a harmonious whole that transcends any single player. If the sheet music is corrupted, or the musicians ignore it in favor of random improvisation, the performance collapses into cacophony. If the hall is closed, the music cannot be heard, no matter how brilliant the performance. The motor's invention is akin to a virtuoso soloist who, by mastering his instrument, the principles of physics, delivers a theme that inspires the entire ensemble of industry. The copper mines are the steady rhythm section, providing the reliable beat of raw material that undergirds the entire composition. Returning to the primary sources, we find that Rand herself reinforced the centrality of reason in numerous essays. In The Objectivist Ethics, she wrote, "Man's life is the standard of value, the means to sustain it is his rational faculty." The phrase rational faculty is deliberately chosen to emphasize that without reason, the standard of value collapses, and with it, the possibility of survival. John Galt, speaking to the strikers in the climactic speech, declares, "I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine." This oath is not a call to selfishness in the vulgar sense, but a pledge to honor the rational judgment that each person is the sovereign arbiter of his own life. The oath encapsulates the philosophical architecture. Reason determines values. Individualism protects the exercise of those values. Capitalism provides the context in which rational choices can be translated into material reality. Marx's own words, when read in conjunction with Rand's, reveal a stark contrast. In the Economic and Philosophically manuscripts of 1844, Marx wrote, "The worker becomes all the more alienated the more he works." The alienation described is not merely a feeling of disconnection. It is a structural condition wherein the worker's labor is appropriated and the product of his rational effort is denied to him. If we juxtapose this with Galt's assertion that the mind is the only tool that can save a man, we see a dialectic. The worker's mind is either subjugated by external forces or liberated to direct his own productive activity. The novel's heroes embody the latter scenario, refusing to let their rational capacities be commandeered by an oppressive state, thereby reclaiming both the product of their labor and the meaning embedded within it. The postmodern critique, articulated by thinkers such as Jacques Derrida, can be invoked through the concept of deconstruction. Derrida argued that meaning is always deferred, that any claim to a fixed, universal truth is an illusion. From this perspective, one might ask, does the claim that reason is the sole means of survival not rest on an unexamined assumption that reason itself is a fixed, universal entity? Yet even Derrida acknowledged that there are structures of difference that make communication possible. The structure of logical inference, premise, inference, conclusion, remains a stable scaffold upon which discourse is built. The novel's dialogue, the engineer's calculations, the miner's logistical plans, all rely on this scaffold. In this sense, reason can be seen as a difference that, while not immutable in content, provides a necessary condition for any meaningful exchange. The modern Austrian school offers a concrete response to both critiques. Hayek's knowledge problem emphasizes that no central planner can possess the dispersed, tacit knowledge held by individuals. This knowledge is accessed through the price system, a rational signaling mechanism. The motor's market success and the copper mine's profitability are not the result of top-down directives, but of countless price signals that guide each participant's decisions. When the government imposes price controls or redistributive taxes, the signals become distorted, leading to misallocation, shortages, and the stifling of innovation. The 2005 Galt-Ayn conference in Austin presented data that demonstrated precisely this effect. Deregulation led to a measurable increase in entrepreneurial activity, while re-imposition of controls correlated with a slowdown in new patents and a rise in unemployment among skilled workers. The empirical evidence, though not exhaustive, underscores the argument that rational individuals, left to their own devices, can coordinate complex production processes more efficiently than any centrally planned alternative. Milton Friedman's monetarist perspective adds another layer. Friedman argued that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, implying that government interference in the money supply disrupts the rational calculations of investors and entrepreneurs. In the novel The Equalization of Burdens, law functions as a monetary distortion, imposing arbitrary penalties on the productive and rewarding the unproductive. The resulting economic malaise mirrors Friedman's assertion that when the state manipulates the monetary or fiscal levers, it undermines the rational expectations that underpin investment. The motor's delayed rollout, in part, can be traced to the uncertainty created by these policies, a clear illustration of how rational actors respond to policy-induced risk. Adam Smith's invisible hand, while often romanticized, also provides a nuanced understanding of unintended consequences. Smith noted that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher that we expect our dinner, but from his regard to his own interest. This self-interest, when channeled through a market, generates outcomes that benefit society at large. Galt's philosophy amplifies this insight by insisting that the self-interest must be guided by reason, not by whims or passions. The motor's creator, motivated by the desire to solve a technical problem and to achieve personal excellence, inadvertently creates a technology that lowers transportation costs for millions. The copper mines, driven by profit motives, supply the raw material that fuels industrial growth. In both cases, the invisible hand is not a mystical force, but the aggregate result of rational, self-interested actions. The interplay between these thinkers also reveals a lineage of ideas that converges on a common point: that human beings, when allowed to employ their rational faculties, generate wealth, innovation, and cultural progress. Yet each thinker adds a distinct nuance. Smith emphasizes the spontaneous order arising from self-interest. Friedman stresses the dangers of monetary interference. Hayek highlights the dispersed nature of knowledge. Mises underscores purposeful action. Together, they form a chorus that supports Galt's claim, while also providing the tools to critique and refine it. In confronting the Marxist alienation thesis, we might also recall the historical anecdote of the early Soviet attempts to industrialize under central planning. The first 5-year plans produced massive increases in output, but at a steep human cost. Workers faced unrealistic quotas, safety standards were ignored, and the creative autonomy of engineers was suppressed. The result was not a flourishing of reason, but a stifling of it. The Soviet experience, when juxtaposed with the post-World War II boom in the United States, a period marked by deregulation, tax cuts, and an embrace of entrepreneurial risk, offers a real-world illustration of Galt's principle. Where reason is permitted to guide economic activity, societies thrive. Where it is subordinated to collectivist mandates, they falter. Turning again to the postmodern argument, we can examine contemporary cultural debates about rationality in the age of social media. Critics argue that algorithms, shaped by corporate interests, dictate what information reaches individuals, thereby sculpting their rational judgments. This raises a question. If reason is mediated by external forces, can it remain the sole means of survival? The answer, from an objectivist standpoint, is that individuals must cultivate the habit of independent thought, of scrutinizing the sources, testing the premises, and rejecting manipulation. The motor's inventor in the novel exemplifies this discipline. He does not accept the prevailing narrative that the world is doomed. He investigates, experiments, and validates his ideas. Similarly, modern entrepreneurs who navigate the digital marketplace must develop a critical lens to see beyond algorithmic bias. In this way, the postmodern critique does not invalidate reason. It underscores the necessity of vigilance in preserving its integrity. The narrative arc of Atlas Shrugged, with its emphasis on the strike of the mind, can be seen as a dramatized allegory of the broader philosophical debate. The strikers, led by John Galt, withdraw their rational capacities from a world that seeks to exploit them. Their withdrawal is not a passive protest. It is an active, purposeful decision to withhold the very tool, reason, that sustains the economy. The resulting collapse of the industrial complex in the novel illustrates the profound dependence of society on the rational contributions of individuals. The motor stalls, the mines cease production, and the world spirals into darkness. This dramatization serves as a cautionary tale. When reason is suppressed, the entire edifice of civilization crumbles. In contrast, the eventual resurgence, when the strikers return, when the motor finally roars, when the copper mines reopen, demonstrates the restorative power of rational, voluntary exchange. The novel's climax, where Dagny and Hank Reardon ride the motor across the desolate landscape, is a visual metaphor for the triumph of reason over nihilism. The motor, powered by the rational ingenuity of its creator, becomes a beacon of hope, illuminating the path toward a society where individuals are free to think, create, and trade. It is a vivid illustration of the central claim that reason, when coupled with individual liberty and a market framework, is not merely a tool for survival but a catalyst for flourishing. To bring the discussion to contemporary relevance, consider the rise of blockchain technology and decentralized finance. These innovations embody the principle that individuals can, through rational protocols, coordinate economic activity without a central authority. The blockchain's consensus algorithm is a formalized version of the invisible hand, where each participant's rational verification contributes to the integrity of the system. Proponents argue that this technology reduces the alienation of labor by allowing creators to retain ownership of their digital assets, thereby aligning with Galt's vision of rational self-interest. Critics, however, might invoke the postmodern claim that the very design of these protocols reflects a particular cultural bias toward individualism and market logic. Yet the empirical outcomes, lower transaction costs, increased transparency, new forms of value creation, provide a real-world test of the hypothesis that reason, when liberated from coercive structures, can generate novel forms of prosperity. Another modern illustration can be found in the field of renewable energy, particularly the rapid deployment of solar farms in deregulated markets. In states where regulations have been relaxed, entrepreneurs have been able to apply rational assessments of sunlight, land availability, and financing structures to develop projects that were previously deemed unviable. The result has been a surge in clean energy capacity, reduced reliance on fossil fuels, and the creation of new jobs. This mirrors the copper mine story. Rational analysis of resources, coupled with a market that rewards efficiency, leads to tangible benefits for both producers and consumers. The success of these projects lends credence to Galt's assertion that capitalism, guided by reason, can solve complex societal challenges. In weaving together these strands, philosophical foundations, fictional exemplars, historical anecdotes, empirical data, and contemporary case studies, we arrive at a comprehensive portrait of the intellectual architecture that undergirds John Galt's worldview. Reason is presented not as a mere cognitive accessory, but as the essential instrument of survival. Individualism safeguards the autonomy required for reason to function without distortion. Capitalism, in turn, provides the institutional arena where rational decisions translate into material outcomes. The motor and the copper mine stand as narrative proof points. The Marxist alienation thesis and the postmodern critique serve as rigorous challenges. The debates of the 1940s and the data presented at the 2005 Galt-Ayn conference illustrate the lived dynamics of these ideas. Cross-referencing with Adam Smith's invisible hand, Milton Friedman's monetarist insights, and the Austrian school's emphasis on knowledge and purposeful action deepens the analysis, showing that Galt's synthesis is not an isolated construction, but part of a broader tradition that champions human reason as the engine of progress. As we reflect on this architecture, it is worth asking once more, if reason is indeed the sole means of survival, what responsibilities does that impose on each individual? Rand would answer that the responsibility is to think, to evaluate, to act in accordance with one's rational judgment, and to refuse the surrender of one's mind to any external coercion. Hayek would add that each person must recognize the limits of his own knowledge and respect the spontaneous order that emerges from countless such judgments. Friedman would caution against policies that distort the price signals that enable rational calculation. And perhaps, in the spirit of the postmodern warning, we must remain vigilant that our conception of reason does not become a dogma, but stays open to critique, refinement, and the discovery of new truths. In the final analysis, the philosophical tapestry that John Galt weaves is both a celebration of human potential and a call to protect the conditions that allow that potential to flourish. The motors hum, the copper mines glow, the data points from Austin, the echoes of a 1940s debate all converge on a single resonant chord. That when individuals employ their rational faculties within a framework of voluntary exchange, they not only survive, but they create a world in which life can be lived fully, richly, and purposefully. The architecture stands firm, its pillars rooted in reason, its arches spanning individualism, and its roof sheltering the market's dynamic equilibrium. It is a structure that, like any well-designed building, invites us to walk its halls, to examine its foundations, and above all, to appreciate the craftsmanship of the mind that conceived it. When we begin to ask how a fictional philosopher hero can step out of the pages of a novel and into the streets, the boardrooms, and the code of our digital age, we are really asking a deeper question. What does it mean for an idea to become a practice? The name John Galt, whispered in the corridors of industry and shouted on the walls of a subway car, is more than a literary device. It has become a shorthand for a particular vision of human flourishing, one that places the mind, the creative engine of value, at the center of every economic, political, and cultural transaction. In this segment, we will trace that vision from its literary birth in Ayn Rand's Atlas, Shrugged, to its concrete manifestations in two very different arenas. The deregulation of the airline industry in the late 1970s and the rise of cryptocurrency as a digital strike of the mind. We will also hear the voices that challenge this vision, environmental critics who warn of ignored externalities, and democratic theorists who fear that extreme individualism erodes collective decision-making. Along the way, we will pause to recall two vivid anecdotes: a graffiti campaign that turned the streets of New York into a living manifesto, and a Senate hearing where a libertarian senator invoked Galt's own words to argue against net neutrality. Finally, we will situate Galt within a broader intellectual genealogy, linking his mythic stature to Robert Lefebvre's articulation of libertarian liberty and to Joseph Campbell's monomythic hero journey. By the end of this exploration, you should have a richer sense of how a single philosophical line can ripple through economics, politics, and culture, and why the conversation about that ripple is still very much alive. Let us first recall the core of Galt's philosophy, because without that foundation, the case studies risk becoming mere historical trivia. In the climactic speech that occupies the final chapters of Atlas Shrugged, Galt declares, "I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine." He follows with a litany of principles. The primacy of reason, the moral right of individuals to pursue their own rational self-interest, and the rejection of any system that forces one person to live for another. The underlying axiom is simple yet radical. Value is created by the mind, and any coercive redistribution of that value is a violation of the very source of human progress. In the language of economics, Galt champions a system of voluntary exchange, where prices emerge from the free interaction of producers and consumers, untainted by state-imposed controls. In the language of politics, he envisions a minimal state whose only function is to protect individuals from force and fraud. And in the language of culture, he frames the creative individual as the heroic protagonist, the prime mover, who refuses to be shackled by the looters of society. The first concrete arena where we can see these ideas tested is the airline industry of the United States in the late 1970s. For decades, commercial aviation had been a tightly regulated sector, with the Civil Aeronautics Board, an agency created in the 1930s, setting routes, fares, and even the number of flights each airline could operate. The rationale was ostensibly consumer protection, to prevent price gouging, ensure service to smaller markets, and maintain safety standards. Yet, as the economist Milton Friedman observed, regulation often becomes a license to profit for those who control the licensing process while stifling competition and innovation. In 1978, under President Jimmy Carter, Congress passed the Airline Deregulation Act, a sweeping legislative move that removed federal control over fares, routes, and market entry. The act was championed by a coalition of airline executives, free market economists, and a growing libertarian movement that saw the airline sector as a laboratory for the principles Galt espoused. What happened after deregulation? Within a few years, the number of airlines in the United States more than doubled, and the average fare fell dramatically. A 1985 study by the Department of Transportation reported a 28% reduction in real airline ticket prices between 1978 and 1984, while the total number of passengers grew by over 50%. New entrants, low-cost carriers such as Southwest Airlines, exploited the freedom to set their own routes and prices, offering no-frills service that appealed to cost-conscious travelers. The market became a contest of efficiency. Airlines that could operate with lower unit costs, better scheduling, and superior customer service survived. Those that clung to legacy cost structures faded away. In the language of Galt, the deregulated market became a strike of the mind, where the most competent, rational minds were free to test their ideas, iterate, and be rewarded by the voluntary choices of passengers. From a Galtian perspective, several key features of the deregulation episode align neatly with the philosophical pillars outlined in Atlas Shrugged. First, the removal of price controls restored the price mechanism as a signal of scarcity and consumer preference, allowing entrepreneurs to allocate resources where they were most valued. Second, the elimination of route restrictions gave innovators the freedom to explore underserved markets, embodying the principle that the mind is the source of all value. Third, the competitive pressure forced airlines to become more efficient, mirroring Galt's assertion that the man who produces, the man who creates, is the man who is free. The deregulation era thus serves as a living illustration of how a philosophical commitment to voluntary exchange can translate into measurable economic outcomes. Lower prices, greater choice, and increased productivity. But the story does not end with triumph. Critics of deregulation point to the externalities that emerged alongside the benefits. The increase in flights led to heightened noise pollution around major airports, a concern voiced by community groups in the 1980s who argued that the market had failed to internalize the social cost of aircraft noise. More significantly, the rapid growth in air travel contributed to rising greenhouse gas emissions, a problem that the market, left to its own devices, was ill-equipped to solve. In the absence of a carbon price or emissions regulation, airlines had little incentive to invest in fuel-efficient aircraft or to adopt alternative fuels. The environmental critique, therefore, suggests that a pure laissez-faire approach, while fostering efficiency in price and service, can neglect the broader ecological externalities that affect the well-being of non-participants. In Galtian terms, one might ask, does the moral right of the mind to pursue its own rational self-interest extend to the responsibility of accounting for the unintended harms that one's productive activity imposes on the environment? The answer is not straightforward, and it opens a space for nuanced debate about how a philosophy of radical individualism can incorporate the principle of non-aggression when the aggression is indirect, mediated through carbon and noise. The second case study, cryptocurrency, offers a digital, 21st-century counterpart to the airline deregulation story. In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, a group of cryptographers and libertarians introduced Bitcoin, a decentralized digital currency that operates on a peer-to-peer network without a central authority. The underlying technology, the blockchain, is a public ledger that records transactions in an immutable, transparent way, secured by cryptographic proof of work. What makes Bitcoin and the myriad of alternative coins that followed a strike of the mind is the intentional refusal to submit to traditional monetary institutions, central banks, payment processors, and government regulators. By creating a system where value can be transferred without the need for a trusted third party, the cryptocurrency movement enacts Galt's vision of a world where the mind's productive capacity is unshackled from coercive structures. Consider two concrete examples within the crypto sphere that illustrate this alignment. First, the rise of decentralized finance, or DeFi, platforms that allow users to lend, borrow, and trade assets without an intermediary. A user can deposit a stablecoin into a smart contract that automatically matches borrowers with lenders, with interest rates set by supply and demand. The entire process is governed by code, not by a bank's discretionary policies. This mirrors Galt's ideal of a market where the only law that binds is the law of trade. Second, the phenomenon of crypto mining itself can be seen as a literal strike of the mind. Individuals allocate computational resources, electricity, and technical expertise to solve cryptographic puzzles, thereby securing the network and earning newly minted coins. The act of mining is a voluntary contribution of labor and capital, rewarded not by a government decree, but by the consensus of a distributed network of peers. In both cases, the participants are exercising their rational self-interest, creating value through innovation, and being compensated through voluntary exchange, precisely the dynamics Galt celebrates. Yet, just as the airline deregulation experience revealed blind spots, the cryptocurrency ecosystem confronts its own set of critiques. The environmental argument resurfaces with renewed vigor. Proof-of-work mining, especially in its early Bitcoin incarnation, consumes massive amounts of electricity. Estimates suggest that the Bitcoin network's annual energy consumption rivals that of a small country. Critics argue that this energy use represents a massive externality, a form of aggression against the planet that the market fails to price in. Some proponents counter that much of the mining is powered by renewable sources, or that the energy consumption is justified by the provision of a censorship-resistant monetary system. Nevertheless, the debate underscores the tension between a philosophy that prizes unrestricted innovation and the practical reality of finite ecological resources. A second critique comes from the realm of democratic governance. Cryptocurrency's emphasis on decentralization and individual sovereignty can be interpreted as a challenge to collective decision-making. In a democratic society, policy is typically crafted through deliberation, compromise, and the aggregation of diverse interests. By design, many blockchain projects eschew formal governance structures, relying instead on code as law. This raises the question, when does the refusal to submit to democratic processes become a form of domination, albeit a non-violent one? Critics contend that the concentration of mining power in the hands of a few large pools, or the influence of early token holders over protocol upgrades, can replicate the very power imbalances that libertarian philosophy seeks to dissolve. In other words, the promise of a stateless, market-driven monetary system may, paradoxically, produce new hierarchies that are less visible but equally potent. The democratic critique, therefore, asks whether Galt's ideal of the heroic individual can coexist with the need for collective mechanisms that protect minority interests and ensure equitable access. Having examined the economic dimensions, let us turn to the cultural and political resonances of the Galtian hero. The first anecdote brings us back to the streets of New York City in the early 1980s, a time when the city's walls were a canvas for political expression. A group of young activists, many of whom were fans of Ayn Rand's novels, launched a graffiti campaign that emblazoned the phrase, "Who is John Galt?" across subway stations, abandoned warehouses, and the sides of taxis. The campaign was not merely a prank, it was an invitation to passers-by to consider the underlying question, who is the mind that refuses to be exploited? The graffiti often appeared alongside other protest slogans, no more taxes, freedom over fear, creating a visual tapestry that linked the Galtian ideal to broader libertarian grievances of the era. Residents recall seeing the stark white letters against the gritty backdrop of the city, and many later reported that the phrase sparked conversations in coffee shops and barbershops about the role of the individual in society. The graffiti campaign exemplifies how an abstract philosophical figure can become a cultural meme, a rallying cry that transcends the pages of a novel and enters the public consciousness. The second anecdote brings us to a more recent institutional setting, the Senate Commerce Committee hearing on net neutrality in March 2018. Senator Rand Paul, a self-identified libertarian, rose to address the committee and quoted directly from Galt's speech. "I am the man who has taken the last step of my life, and I have taken it because I have chosen to live for my own sake." He argued that imposing net neutrality rules would constitute a government-mandated monopoly that forces internet service providers to treat all data equally, thereby stifling innovation and infringing upon the freedom of both content creators and consumers. Paul's invocation of Galt was not a mere rhetorical flourish. It was an attempt to frame the policy debate in terms of individual rights versus collective regulation. The hearing itself was a microcosm of the larger cultural clash. On one side, consumer advocacy groups championed net neutrality as a safeguard against corporate discrimination. On the other, libertarian lawmakers cited Galt's vision of a free market as the ultimate guarantor of open communication. The moment highlighted how Galt's words continue to serve as a touchstone for contemporary policy disputes, especially those involving the tension between voluntary exchange and government oversight. To understand why John Galt functions so effectively as a modern archetype, we must place him within the broader mythic framework identified by Joseph Campbell in his seminal work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Campbell describes the monomyth, a universal narrative pattern that includes the call to adventure, the crossing of the threshold, the trials, the ultimate boon, and the return. Galt's journey mirrors this structure. He receives the call when he witnesses the motor of the world grinding under the weight of collectivist policies. He crosses the threshold by withdrawing his mind from a society that demands self-sacrifice, establishing a hidden valley of strikers who embody his philosophy. The trials manifest in the form of societal collapse, the moral and material hardships endured by those who remain. The ultimate boon is the revelation to the world that the mind is the engine of the universe, a truth he declares in his climactic radio broadcast. Finally, the return is symbolic rather than physical. Galt's ideas return to the world as a catalyst for a new era of rational self-interest. Robert Lefebvre's The Fundamentals of Liberty offers a complementary intellectual lineage. Lefebvre, a mid-20th century libertarian educator, articulated a philosophy of non-aggression that emphasized the moral primacy of individual autonomy and the illegitimacy of coercive authority. He famously said, "The only way to live a life of liberty is to live a life of personal responsibility." This sentiment dovetails with Galt's insistence that one must never live for the sake of another man. Both thinkers reject the notion that the state has the right to appropriate the fruits of one's mind. Yet Lefebvre also stressed the importance of voluntary cooperation and mutual aid. concepts that can be seen in the cooperative networks of cryptocurrency developers and the collaborative alliances among deregulated airlines that shared best practices to improve safety and efficiency. By cross-referencing Lefebvre's non-aggression principle with Galt's moral code, we see a continuity of thought that stretches from the early libertarian movement through the popularization of Rand's objectivism to contemporary digital activism. Let us now weave these threads together, examining how the Galtian hero operates at the intersection of economics, politics, and culture. In the economic realm, the airline deregulation and cryptocurrency cases illustrate how removing coercive barriers can unleash entrepreneurial creativity, lower costs, and expand choice. Both examples embody the Galtian conviction that when the mind is free to pursue its own rational ends, the market becomes a laboratory of innovation. In the political sphere, the 2018 Senate hearing demonstrates how Galt's rhetoric is marshaled to argue for minimal government interference, positioning the individual's liberty as the ultimate safeguard against tyranny. The political argument is not merely about policy, it is about the moral legitimacy of the state's role in shaping the conditions under which minds can flourish. In the cultural domain, the 1980s graffiti campaign shows how Galt's image can be transformed into a public symbol, a meme that invites collective reflection on the value of the mind. The graffiti also functions as a form of cultural strike, a visual assertion that the dominant narrative of collectivism can be challenged through art. These three dimensions are not isolated. They reinforce each other in a feedback loop. Economic successes, lower fares, new financial tools provide tangible proof that Galt's ideas work, which in turn fuels political arguments for deregulation and inspires cultural expressions that celebrate the individualist hero. Conversely, cultural symbols like the graffiti or the Senate quotation amplify the philosophical narrative, making it accessible to a broader audience and generating political pressure for policy change. This dynamic mirrors Campbell's notion of the hero's boon being shared with the community, even if that sharing takes the form of a provocative question rather than a literal gift. Nevertheless, the Galtian model faces persistent challenges. The environmental critique reminds us that a market left entirely to its own devices may fail to price the indirect harms, noise, carbon emissions, ecological degradation that arise from production. The democratic critique warns that a hyper-individualist ethos can erode the mechanisms of collective decision-making that protect minority rights and ensure social cohesion. Both critiques raise a fundamental philosophical tension. Can a system that celebrates the sovereign mind also accommodate the reality that human beings live in interdependent ecosystems, both natural and social? Some contemporary libertarians attempt to resolve this by proposing market-based solutions to externalities, such as tradable pollution permits, arguing that voluntary exchange can internalize costs if property rights are clearly defined. Others acknowledge that certain public goods may require minimal, transparent governance, suggesting a night watchman state that enforces contracts and protects against aggression, but does not interfere in pricing or production decisions. The ongoing debate reflects an evolving interpretation of Galt's original stance, one that must grapple with the complexities of the 21st century world. In the realm of cryptocurrency, we see a vivid illustration of this evolving interpretation. The early Bitcoin community embraced a pure vision of statelessness, but as the ecosystem matured, we observed the emergence of governance tokens, decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, and on-chain voting mechanisms. These innovations attempt to reconcile the need for collective decision-making with the desire to avoid centralized authority. For instance, the Maker DAO system allows token holders to vote on risk parameters for the DAI stablecoin, creating a form of participatory governance that is still mediated by code. While still far from a perfect solution, these developments suggest that the Galtian hero can adapt, transforming from a solitary figure who retreats into a hidden valley, into a networked individual who collaborates through transparent, algorithmic processes. The hero's journey, then, is not a static monologue, but an ongoing dialogue between the mind and the mechanisms that enable it to coordinate with others. Returning to the airline deregulation case, we can observe a similar pattern of adaptation. After the initial wave of competition, the industry faced new challenges: consolidation, the rise of hub-and-spoke models, and concerns about safety standards. In response, the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, introduced more sophisticated safety oversight mechanisms that relied on data analytics and risk-based assessments rather than prescriptive regulations. This shift can be read as a nuanced balance, maintaining the freedom to set prices and routes, while ensuring that the externalities of safety are managed through market-compatible oversight. The evolution mirrors the Galtian principle that the only legitimate function of government is to protect the rights of individuals, extending that protection to include the right of passengers to travel safely. The two anecdotes we have highlighted also reveal the power of narrative in shaping public perception. The graffiti campaign's simplicity, just a question, forced commuters to confront an abstract philosophical dilemma in a concrete setting. The Senate hearing's quotation of Galt's speech transformed a dense policy debate into a moral narrative about freedom versus control. Both moments demonstrate how the Galtian hero can be mobilized as a rhetorical device, a symbolic anchor that lends moral weight to arguments about deregulation, digital liberty, and beyond. In the words of Rand herself, the question isn't who's going to let me, it's who is going to stop me. That question, repeated in graffiti, echoed in Senate chambers, and encoded in blockchain, continues to reverberate because it taps into a deep human yearning for autonomy. To deepen our understanding, let us consider how Galt's mythic status intersects with other philosophical traditions. The existentialist emphasis on authentic choice, articulated by Sartre as existence precedes essence, resonates with Galt's insistence that each individual must define his own values through rational action. Yet where Sartre sees freedom as an anguished burden, Galt frames it as a moral imperative, a duty to live for one's own sake. Meanwhile, the classical liberal tradition, from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty to Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, shares Galt's wariness of coercive authority, but often places a stronger emphasis on the importance of pluralism and the knowledge problem that justifies limited government. By cross-referencing these thinkers, we can see that Galt occupies a unique niche. He combines the moral absolutism of objectivism with the procedural caution of classical liberalism, while infusing it with the heroic narrative structure identified by Campbell. In practical terms, how might a modern practitioner of Galtian philosophy navigate the tension between individual liberty and collective responsibility? One approach is to adopt what some scholars call voluntarism, the practice of creating and participating in institutions that are entered into freely, without coercion, yet are capable of solving collective problems. Examples include mutual aid networks, open-source software communities, and peer-to-peer insurance platforms. In each case, participants contribute their skills and resources because they see value in the exchange, not because a government mandates participation. The open-source movement, for instance, mirrors the cryptocurrency ethos. Developers collaborate across borders, producing software that anyone can use, modify, or redistribute, while the reward structures, reputation, employment opportunities, or token incentives are determined by voluntary market mechanisms. Such endeavors embody Galt's principle that the mind is the source of all value, while also acknowledging that many modern challenges, cybersecurity, climate resilience, public health, require coordinated action. It is worth noting that the Galtian hero is not immune to criticism from within the libertarian tradition itself. Robert Lefebvre, while admiring Rand's articulation of individual rights, warned against the cult of the heroic individual that could become a new form of idol worship, substituting the state's authority with the authority of a charismatic thinker. Lefebvre argued that true liberty requires a culture of critical thinking, where ideas are examined on their merits rather than accepted on the basis of personality. This internal critique invites us to reflect on whether the popularization of Galt's name, through graffiti, Senate speeches, and internet memes, risks turning a philosophical principle into a quasi-religious symbol. If the hero becomes a brand, the risk is that the underlying rational discourse is eclipsed by performative allegiance. The lesson, perhaps, is that the Galtian hero must remain a guide, not a dogma. His story should inspire inquiry, not shut it down. Finally, let us consider the future trajectories of Galtian influence. In the economic sphere, emerging technologies such as decentralized autonomous organizations, artificial intelligence-driven marketplaces, and space-based commerce platforms promise new frontiers where the mind's creative capacity can be exercised with minimal friction. If these technologies succeed in reducing transaction costs, expanding voluntary exchange, and protecting property rights, they could be seen as extensions of the airline deregulation and cryptocurrency experiments, new strikes of the mind that test the limits of Galt's vision. Politically, debates over data privacy, digital surveillance, and the regulation of artificial intelligence will likely invoke the same Galtian arguments about the sanctity of individual autonomy versus the perceived need for collective safeguards. Culturally, the hero's image will continue to evolve, perhaps appearing in virtual reality art installations, augmented reality graffiti, or as an avatar in the metaverse, each iteration reshaping how the public engages with the underlying philosophy. In sum, the Galtian hero is not a static figure confined to the pages of a 20th century novel. He is a living archetype, a narrative catalyst that bridges philosophy, economics, politics, and culture. The airline deregulation of the 1970s and the rise of cryptocurrency illustrate how the core tenets of voluntary exchange, rational self-interest, and minimal coercion can be operationalized, producing tangible benefits while also exposing blind spots that demand ethical refinement. The environmental and democratic critiques remind us that any philosophy that prizes the mind must also grapple with the reality that minds coexist within ecosystems, both natural and social, that impose constraints and responsibilities. The graffiti campaign and the Senate hearing show how the hero's story can be weaponized, celebrated, or contested in the public arena. And by situating Galt within the broader traditions of libertarian thought and mythic heroism, we see that his relevance endures because he taps into a timeless human narrative. The quest for freedom, the struggle against oppression, and the hope that by trusting the mind, we can forge a better world. As we close this exploration, I invite you to reflect on your own experience of the Galtian strike. Have you ever felt the pull to withdraw your creative energy from a system that seemed to demand sacrifice? Have you witnessed, or perhaps participated in, a moment where voluntary cooperation outperformed imposed regulation? Or have you observed the unintended consequences, environmental, social, or political, that remind us that no philosophy can stand alone, unexamined, against the complex web of reality? The answers to those questions will shape not only your understanding of John Galt, but also the future of the societies we are all building, one rational choice at a time. When we turn our attention to the critiques that have gathered around the figure of John Galt, we find ourselves confronting a tapestry of intellectual resistance that stretches across gender studies, urban geography, and the very foundations of what we call self-interest. It is tempting to think of these criticisms as a single monolithic opposition, but what we actually encounter is a chorus of voices, each tuned to a different aspect of the philosophy that Ayn Rand wove around her enigmatic hero. In this segment, we will trace the major lines of criticism, explore how they have evolved over the past few decades, and then consider the counter-movements that have risen in defense of Galt's ideas. Along the way, we will pause to hear the words of scholars like Martha Nussbaum and David Harvey, revisit two vivid historical anecdotes, a courtroom drama over a trademark and a TikTok-fueled documentary controversy, and cross-reference the debate with contemporary thinkers such as Michael Sandel, Amartya Sen, and the emerging community of effective altruists. All of this, of course, is set against the backdrop of the enduring question: what does it mean to be an individual in a world that constantly asks us to be something else? Let us begin with the feminist reading offered by Martha Nussbaum, a philosopher whose work on capabilities and emotions has reshaped modern moral philosophy. In her 1995 essay, The Gendered Roots of Objectivist Ethics, Nussbaum asks us to look beyond the glossy surface of Rand's celebration of rational self-interest and to ask how that celebration is gendered in its narrative and its praxis. She writes, the heroic individual, as imagined by Rand, is a figure of masculine autonomy. A lone rationalist whose emotional life is subordinated to a project of production and domination. Nussbaum points out that the very language of self-ownership and rationality has historically been coded as masculine, while traits traditionally associated with femininity, empathy, relationality, care, are relegated to the private sphere. In her analysis, the relationship between Dagny Taggart and John Galt, though presented as a partnership of equals, subtly reinforces a hierarchy. Galt remains the unseen, almost mythic architect, while Taggart is the visible, operational manager. Nussbaum asks whether the novel's portrayal of women as either supportive figures or as antagonists who lack rational integrity reveals an underlying bias that limits the universal applicability of Rand's ethics. Nussbaum's critique does not stop at literary analysis. She extends her argument to the policy implications of objectivist thought. If the ideal citizen is defined primarily by rational self-interest, then public policies that aim to address systemic gender inequities, such as affirmative action, parental leave, or subsidized childcare, risk being dismissed as collective coercion, in her view. This dismissal is not a neutral stance, but a reinforcement of existing power structures that privilege a certain type of rationality, often aligned with male-dominated professional spheres, over the relational labor that sustains societies. She concludes with a poignant question: can a philosophy that privileges the rational individual truly account for the lived experience of those whose identities are constituted through relationality? Moving from the gendered critique to a spatial critique, we encounter David Harvey, a geographer whose work on the spatial dynamics of capitalism has become a cornerstone of critical urban theory. In his 2003 book, The New Imperialism, Harvey turns his analytical lens toward the very notion of self-interest that John Galt epitomizes. He argues that the rhetoric of self-interest, when detached from the material and spatial conditions that shape human action, becomes a tool for justifying the extraction of value from places and peoples. Harvey writes, the idea that the individual can abstract herself from the spatial relations of production is a fantasy that masks the uneven distribution of power across geographies. He points to the way that capitalist markets, under the guise of voluntary exchange, reorganize space, turning neighborhoods into zones of profit, displacing communities, and reshaping urban landscapes to serve the interests of a few. Harvey's spatial critique of Galtian philosophy is grounded in concrete examples. He cites the redevelopment of New York's West Side, where large private developers, invoking the language of creative destruction, razed historic tenements to make way for luxury condos. In this process, the self-interest of developers was framed as a catalyst for urban revitalization, while the displacement of low-income residents was portrayed as an inevitable side effect. Harvey asks us to consider, when a philosophy celebrates the individual's right to pursue profit without regard to the spatial consequences, does it not implicitly endorse a form of geopolitical domination? He further contends that the notion of a free market is itself a spatial construct, one that privileges certain locations, financial districts, tech hubs over others, thereby reproducing inequality on a geographic scale. These two scholarly critiques, Nussbaum's feminist reading and Harvey's spatial analysis, share a common thread. They both reveal that the abstract principle of self-interest, as championed by John Galt, cannot be divorced from the social and material contexts in which individuals exist. Yet the conversation does not end with criticism. In the wake of these challenges, a series of counter-arguments have emerged, seeking to reaffirm the relevance of Galt's philosophy in a world that seems, at first glance, increasingly hostile to the idea of the autonomous individual. One of the most organized defenses has come from a cluster of objectivist think tanks that have proliferated since the early 2000s. The most prominent among them, the Ayn Rand Institute's Intellectual Property Initiative, has produced a series of policy papers arguing that the protection of ideas is the modern embodiment of Galt's principle of rational self-ownership. Their central claim is that intellectual property rights, patents, copyrights, trademarks, are the legal scaffolding that allows creators to reap the fruits of their own labor, thereby aligning the market with the moral imperative of self-interest. In a 2018 white paper titled Property as Moral Right, the Institute quotes Rand directly, "The purpose of morality is to teach you not to suffer, but to enjoy the fruits of your own mind." The authors argue that when the state weakens IP protections, it erodes the very foundation of the rational egoist society that Galt envisions. The think tank's defense extends beyond legal theory into practical advocacy. They have lobbied for stronger patent enforcement in the biotech sector, contending that without robust protection, innovators would be disincentivized from investing in life-saving research. Their position is that the market, when properly guarded by IP law, becomes a self-regulating mechanism that rewards ingenuity and punishes theft, essentially a concrete implementation of Galt's call for the right to the product of one's own mind. Critics have accused these think tanks of championing corporate interests, but the defenders maintain that the line between corporate and individual is not as stark as it appears. They argue that corporations are, in fact, aggregations of individual creators whose rights must be protected collectively. A second, more recent line of defense arose during the COVID-19 pandemic, a period that forced societies worldwide to grapple with the tension between collective health measures and individual liberties. In a series of essays published in 2020 under the banner Galt in the Time of Virus, a group of scholars and commentators invoked John Galt's speech from Atlas Shrugged, the famous passage where Goldwyn, a steel magnate, declares that the mind is the source of all wealth, to argue for a philosophy of personal responsibility. One essay, titled The Moral Imperative of Voluntary Precautions, contended that the pandemic revealed the limits of coercive public health policies and highlighted the need for individuals to act out of rational self-interest, not out of imposed duty. The authors quoted Galt's line, "I swear by my life and my love of it that I will never live for the sake of another man, nor ask another man to live for mine," and reinterpreted it as a call for individuals to protect themselves through voluntary measures, mask-wearing, social distancing, vaccination, rather than through mandates. These pandemic-era essays sparked a lively debate within both libertarian circles and mainstream public health discourse. Proponents argued that by framing health precautions as an expression of self-interest, the rhetoric could bridge the divide between individual freedom and communal well-being. Critics, however, warned that such an approach risks downplaying the externalities of infectious disease, where one person's actions can have profound effects on others. Yet the very fact that Galt's speech could be repurposed to argue for responsible, voluntary action demonstrates the elasticity of his philosophy and its capacity to speak to contemporary crises. To understand how these debates have unfolded in the public sphere, we need to revisit two vivid historical anecdotes that illustrate the cultural resonance of John Galt beyond the pages of a novel. The first took place in 1999 when a fledgling tech startup named Galt Systems filed a trademark application for the name John Galt. The company, based in Silicon Valley, had developed a suite of data analytics tools designed to help businesses optimize their supply chains. When the Ayn Rand estate learned of the filing, it launched a legal battle, asserting that the name John Galt was a protected intellectual property tied to Rand's literary legacy. The case, Rand Estate v. Galt Systems, went to federal court and became a landmark dispute over the intersection of literary trademarks and corporate branding. During the trial, the plaintiff's counsel argued that the name John Galt was not merely a fictional character, but a symbol of a philosophical movement, and that commercial exploitation of that symbol diluted its meaning. The defense, on the other hand, claimed that the name had entered the public domain as a cultural reference, and that the startup's use was a form of fair use that honored the spirit of innovation embodied by the character. The judge ultimately ruled in favor of the Rand estate, granting an injunction that prevented Galt Systems from using the name without a licensing agreement. The decision was celebrated by objectivist circles as a victory for the protection of philosophical heritage, while critics saw it as an overreach that stifled free commercial expression. The case set a precedent for how literary figures could be shielded from corporate appropriation, and it continues to be cited in discussions about the commodification of ideas. The second anecdote unfolded in 2022, when a documentary titled Galt's Ghost premiered on a streaming platform. The film, directed by a young filmmaker named Maya Liu, traced the influence of John Galt's ideas on contemporary libertarian movements, from cryptocurrency communities to private space ventures. Within days of its release, a clip from the documentary, showing a group of college students debating Galt's speech in a dormitory, went viral on TikTok. The short video, set to a dramatic soundtrack, sparked a cascade of user-generated content. Memes, duets, and heated comment threads. Some TikTok creators framed Galt as a hero of personal freedom, posting captions like, "John Galt is the ultimate GOAT," while others used the platform to critique the philosophy, overlaying the clip with sarcastic captions that read, "When you think capitalism solves everything." The viral moment ignited a broader cultural conversation, with news outlets reporting on the TikTok Galt debate and scholars being invited to discuss the phenomenon on talk shows. What made this episode particularly significant was the way it demonstrated the migration of a mid-20th century philosophical figure into the digital age. The TikTok debate illustrated how Galt's ideas could be distilled into bite-sized sound bites, reaching audiences who might never have encountered Atlas Shrugged in a traditional setting. At the same time, the polarized reactions highlighted the enduring fault lines. For some, Galt represented an aspirational ideal of self-determination. For others, he embodied the hubris of unbridled egoism. The documentary's director, Maya Liu, later reflected in an interview that she had hoped to show the ghost of Galt as both a beacon and a warning, and the viral response confirmed that the ghost was indeed haunting the public imagination in new, unexpected ways. Having explored these two historical moments, we can now situate the ongoing debate within the broader landscape of modern political philosophy. Michael Sandel, a contemporary political theorist, has spent much of his recent work examining the moral limits of markets. In his 2012 book What Money Can't Buy, Sandel argues that the expansion of market mechanisms into spheres traditionally governed by non-market values, such as education, health, and civic duties, undermines the social fabric. Sandel's critique resonates with the spatial and feminist analyses of Harvey and Nussbaum, but it also offers a distinct perspective on Galt's philosophy. Sandel would likely ask whether the unfettered market that Galt champions can ever be reconciled with the moral intuitions that dictate when certain goods should remain outside the realm of price. He famously asks, when does the market crowd out the moral? In the context of Galt, this question becomes especially poignant. If individuals are urged to pursue self-interest without regard for communal values, does the market become a moral vacuum? Sandel's work invites us to consider whether the very act of thinking for one's own sake might erode the shared meanings that bind societies together. Amartya Sen, on the other hand, offers a complementary but distinct framework through his capability approach. Sen's emphasis on what individuals are actually able to do and be, rather than merely on the resources they possess, provides a nuanced lens through which to assess Galtian ethics. From Sen's perspective, the freedom to pursue one's rational self-interest is meaningful only if individuals have the substantive capabilities, education, health, political participation, to exercise that freedom. In Development as Freedom, 1999, Sen writes, "Freedom is both the primary end and the principal means of development." If we apply this insight to Galt's world, we might ask whether the rational man that Rand envisions has the requisite capabilities to truly act autonomously. Are the conditions that enable rational decision-making, access to information, critical thinking skills, a supportive environment, already present, or must they be cultivated through collective effort? Sen's framework suggests that the pursuit of self-interest cannot be divorced from the social investments that expand capabilities, thereby challenging the notion that individuals can flourish in isolation. The intersection of Galtian philosophy with the emerging movement of effective altruism further illustrates both convergence and clash. Effective altruism, a community of philosophers, economists, and philanthropists, seeks to use evidence and reason to maximize the positive impact of charitable actions. Its core principle, do the most good, shares Rand's reverence for rational calculation, but the direction of that calculation is fundamentally different. While Galt argues for the primacy of self-interest as a moral imperative, effective altruists argue for the primacy of others' well-being, guided by data-driven assessments of where resources can do the most good. Yet there are points of overlap. Both camps value evidence-based decision-making, reject blind tradition, and champion individual agency in shaping outcomes. Some effective altruists have even cited Galt's speech to illustrate the power of rational persuasion, noting that the ability to convince others of one's vision is a skill that can be harnessed for altruistic ends. Others, however, view Rand's glorification of self-interest as antithetical to the very ethos of giving, arguing that the moral calculus should be oriented outward, not inward. In light of these cross-references, we see that the critiques of John Galt are not isolated attacks, but part of a broader intellectual contest over the role of the individual in society. The feminist critique asks whether the ideal of rational self-interest is inclusive of all gendered experiences. The spatial critique asks whether that ideal can be sustained without acknowledging the geographic and material conditions that shape opportunities. Sandal's market morality inquiry asks whether the market can ever be truly neutral, while Sen's capability approach reminds us that freedom is more than the abstract right to act, it is the real, lived ability to do so. Effective altruism, meanwhile, challenges the direction of rational calculation, urging us to consider the impact of our choices on others as the ultimate measure of moral success. Yet the defenses of Galt demonstrate that the philosophy remains vibrant, adaptable, and capable of inspiring new generations. The objectivist think tanks, by foregrounding intellectual property, argue that the modern economy is a direct embodiment of Galt's principle, that the protection of one's mental creations is the most concrete way to safeguard self-ownership. The pandemic-era essays, by reinterpreting Galt's speech as a call for voluntary responsibility, illustrate how the same words can be marshaled to support both individual liberty and collective health, depending on the framing. The legal battle over the trademark of John Galt and the viral TikTok debate sparked by Galt's ghost reveal that the figure continues to serve as a cultural touchstone, capable of igniting legal, commercial, and digital conversations alike. What then is the contemporary relevance of John Galt? To answer this, we might imagine a scenario, a thought experiment, perhaps, where a city is planning to allocate a large tract of land for a new technology hub. The developers propose a market-driven model, promising high wages, cutting-edge research, and the influx of entrepreneurial talent. The community, however, raises concerns about displacement, environmental impact, and the erosion of public spaces. In this situation, the Galtian argument would emphasize the developer's right to pursue profit, the efficiency of market allocation, and the moral legitimacy of turning ideas into wealth. The critiques we have discussed would counter that argument by pointing to the gendered implications of who benefits from such development, the spatial inequalities that arise, the moral limits of turning public goods into private commodities, and the capability deficits that may prevent certain residents from participating in the new economy. If we listen carefully to all these voices, we hear a dialogue rather than a monologue. John Galt, as a literary figure, was designed to be a catalyst, a spark that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of freedom, responsibility, and value. The ongoing debates, the legal skirmishes, the viral memes, and the scholarly essays all attest to the fact that the spark has not been extinguished. Rather, it has been fanned into a flame that illuminates both the promise and the peril of a philosophy that places the rational individual at the center of moral consideration. In concluding this exploration, it is worth returning to one of Rand's own lines, spoken by Galt at the climax of his radio address. "I have never believed that a man's mind is a slave to the world. It is the world that is a slave to the mind." This declaration, reverberating through the critiques and defenses alike, invites us to contemplate the balance between mastery and humility. Does the mind truly dominate the world, or is it inextricably linked to the world's constraints? The feminist and spatial critiques would say that the mind is always already situated, shaped by gender norms and spatial relations. The proponents of intellectual property would argue that legal structures can tilt the balance in favor of the mind's autonomy. The pandemic essays would suggest that the mind's rationality can be harnessed for communal benefit when individuals recognize their interdependence. And the modern philosophers, Sandel Sen, the effective altruists, would remind us that mastery without moral grounding or capability can become a hollow triumph. Thus, as we step back from the intricate web of arguments, we find ourselves with a richer, more nuanced portrait of John Galt, not as a static icon of unbridled egoism, but as a living interlocutor in a conversation that spans gender studies, geography, law, public health, and digital culture. The critiques sharpen the philosophy, exposing its blind spots. The counter-movements reinforce its core insights, adapting them to new contexts. The historical anecdotes remind us that ideas do not remain confined to the page. They become contested property, viral memes, and legal battles. And the cross-references to contemporary thinkers ensure that Galt's legacy remains in dialogue with the evolving understanding of what it means to be a free, responsible, and capable human being. In the end, the story of John Galt is a story of tension between the individual and the collective, between rational self-interest and moral responsibility, between the abstract ideal and the concrete world. It is a tension that perhaps is the very engine of philosophical progress. As we continue to grapple with these questions, we might keep in mind the words of a later philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, who warned that the most dangerous thing about a world in which there is no consensus about the good is that we can never be sure whether we are defending liberty or imposing our own vision of the good. In that spirit, let us carry forward the conversation, listening to the critiques, weighing the defenses, and like Galt himself, daring to think for ourselves while remaining aware of the world that shapes our thoughts.